The metal fork fell from the graceful female fingers, with a loud sound, hitting the edge of the table and attracting the attention of everyone present, as if marking the beginning of something important. The charming woman, smiling tensely, as if trying to maintain an outward calm, carefully turned to her father with a clarifying question, trying to understand what exactly he wanted to say. The majestic man, seated at the head of the table with an expression of stern inflexibility, calmly and gravely declared that his daughter was obliged to marry Duke Christo, as family tradition demanded. A young girl with snow-white hair, like winter snow, closed her eyes in thought, slowly biting off a piece of fresh bread, enjoying its soft taste and the peace around her. The woman's teeth tore off a small piece of bread with ease, and small golden crumbs fell softly down like grains of sand of time, marking every movement of her serene meal. Duke Arno Christo, a stately man with deep night sky black hair and eyes burning with the fire of determination, was the one who repeatedly led the empire to triumph, becoming the living embodiment of the strength and greatness of his era. Half a century ago, at the very moment when a long and destructive war finally came to an end, a mysterious young man in a heavy fur cape disappeared without a trace, leaving behind only a trail of mystery and many questions. The elegant woman at the table, slightly bowing her head and raising a thin eyebrow, noted in a restrained voice that there were rumors that the Duke might have left this world long ago, although the real truth remained shrouded in secrecy. The head of the family, a fair-haired man with piercing eyes, chuckled, but his voice was firm and decisive as he reminded everyone that this was the will of the imperial family itself, confirmed by the official seal and an unbreakable treaty. He added, with just the slightest hint of sarcasm, that the marriage would be such an expensive pleasure that it would require a whole bag filled with glittering gold coins, the symbol of the wealth and power that would seal the union. The noble lady, sharply frowning her thin eyebrows, restrainedly but firmly stated that she could not agree with the position of the head of the family, adding that the Duke, by all accounts, should have already crossed the threshold of 70 years, which made the proposal dubious. The graceful girl, with her hands folded in front of her, addressed her mother politely and gently, asking her to remain calm, and with sincere trepidation in her voice, added that it would be a great honor for her to give all her strength for the well-being of the family. Isabella, looking like the image of a true victim, had a hard time hiding the tears that were welling up in the corners of her eyes, trying not to show her weakness in front of her family and to maintain her dignity despite the emotions that had overwhelmed her. Unexpectedly, the father, smiling softly, tried to calm his worried daughter, assuring her that he had no intention of so easily handing over his own flesh and blood into the hands of an elderly and rich aristocrat, no matter how influential he was. The wife, clearly shocked by what she had heard, stopped dead in her tracks, staring at her husband in astonishment, as if she could not believe that these words could have escaped his lips at such a moment. The married couple, exchanging unpleasant, almost malicious grins, suddenly became quiet when the thought surfaced in their minds that they still had another daughter, albeit adopted, but quite suitable for resolving such a delicate issue. On the opposite side of the table, with her hands modestly folded, sat a young girl with long snow-white hair that fell in soft waves over her shoulders. The aristocrat suddenly stood up from the table and, screaming, called out to her friend named Calendia, expressing anger that she had not paid any attention to her at all and continued to ignore her presence. The previously modest beauty suddenly frowned angrily, letting her sharp character out, asking with displeasure if they had finally finished their conversation, tired of meaningless words and a drawn-out conversation. The family was deeply upset by such behavior of their adopted daughter, not understanding what could have led to such a sharp and unexpected act, which seemed absurd and cruel to them. Calendia, in turn, began to complain, saying that she worked from morning until night, and this was the first time her family had invited her to have lunch with them, as if deciding that she deserved this little joy. Of all the food she received, she was only served a bowl of soup and a loaf of bread, and without a spoon, which only increased her dissatisfaction and feeling of resentment towards her family. The lady, unable to contain herself, shouted loudly that she would be much better and more comfortable next to the old Duke than with them, so cold and uncomprehending. Calendia walked quickly away from her stunned family, deciding to leave them behind without looking back to see their confused faces. Suddenly, Isabella, unable to contain her emotions, reached out and tried to grab her sister, hoping to stop her, but not knowing how to put everything back in place. Feigning innocence, the lady stated with cold confidence that her little sister could always return to them if she felt ill, but with a slight hint of indifference in her voice. Isabella hugged her interlocutor, holding her tightly to herself, as if trying to create the illusion of warmth and friendliness, which seemed completely insincere and more like a theatrical gesture. With a mocking grin, which she skillfully hid behind an outward appearance of good nature, the girl angrily whispered that she always felt sorry for her imaginary mockery, although in her heart she never believed these words. There was no sincerity on the noblewoman's face. Instead, there was a hidden hatred that was revealed for a moment in her grimace, hidden from prying eyes during the moments of close embrace. The woman's hand suddenly pushed her interlocutor away, as if breaking the last thread of pretense, leaving in the air a feeling of sharp rejection and tension that filled the entire scene. Isabella, with a painful cry, collapsed to the floor like a doll, lifelessly sagging, while skillfully feigning suffering, as if the blow had caused her not only physical, but also mental pain. The family immediately rushed to their own daughter, surrounding her with care and concern, without thinking about the truth of the situation and immediately accusing the adopted girl of inhumanity and cruelty. A bright scarlet imprint burned on the blonde's delicate cheek, leaving a feeling of burning pain. And a moment later, someone roughly grabbed her by the hair, forcing her to rise up, as if demonstrating complete superiority over her. While Calendia was writhing on the floor in pain, the mother rushed in panic to her own daughter, tenderly hugging her and anxiously asking if everything was okay, without even looking in the direction of the suffering girl. The family, which seemed happy and ideal, was in reality quite different, because while Calendia was being bullied, her mother and sister stood quietly aside, as if watching a performance that did not affect them in the least. Calendia's gaze, filled with anger, disgust, and deep hatred, seemed like a silent protest against all the injustice that had surrounded her since childhood. Isabella smiled crookedly and meanly, glad that fate, as it seemed to her, was playing on her side. The old man would no longer become her fiancé, and the hated adopted sister would soon disappear from her life. Calendia herself, sitting on the cold floor, thought only about how she was ready to do anything just to escape from this cruel and soulless house, where her existence had no meaning, and where she felt completely unnecessary and forgotten. The baby was born to a marquis family who had good intentions and loving parents, but soon found that their reputation began to crumble, and with it, their whole life, when the family affairs began to fail due to financial problems and failures. Mother became seriously ill, and father, having spent all his savings on treating his beloved wife, sat next to her bed, trying to somehow ease her suffering until all that was left for them was hopeless waiting. Eventually left an orphan and adopted at the age of 8 into a home that was supposed to be a new beginning, but in reality turned out to be another prison where she could not find happiness. Dressed in a luxurious dress, she couldn't help but remember how decent sums had been allocated for her upkeep so that her new family would accept her. But all that money and care could not give her the sense of belonging or warmth that she so desperately sought. The carriage moved slowly along the road, following the horses, who confidently led it through the forest, their hooves leaving soft traces in the ground, and the sounds of their steps merging with the silence of nature, creating a feeling of complete solitude. Initially, the entire noble family seemed benevolent and dignified. But soon, as the acquaintance continued, each of them showed their true colors, turning out to be evil and vile people, ready to do anything for their own interests. As she traveled, the lady wondered what could have prompted the Duke, who had been single for so many years, to suddenly make such a decision, wondering what exactly had prompted him to change his outlook on life. With a smile on her lips, Calendia sighed with relief, feeling all her worries disappear as she finally escaped the company of unpleasant and arrogant relatives, whose presence always darkened her life, making her feel like an outsider. Soon the carriage reached its destination, and the coachman, rising from his seat, opened the door with an air as if an important ritual had been completed, loudly announcing that they had finally arrived at the right place, and now a new chapter of life lay before them. Looking around in surprise, Calendia got out of the carriage, and, unable to contain her emotions, her mouth opened in shock and amazement, because before her eyes appeared a completely different world, which she had previously only dreamed of, but could not even imagine. The butler, who came out to greet the young lady, introduced himself as Riley, and with the courtesy only true servants possessed, bowed, bidding her follow him and enter the house, which was now becoming her new home. Politely accepting the lady's things, Riley pointed to the stately mansion, inviting her to enter and begin a new life that seemed full of promise and new opportunities, giving hope for a better future. Calendia entered the spacious hall, feeling the softness of the furniture beneath her, and, sitting down, curiously asked the servant where her future husband was. Feeling a little out of place, surrounded by a new and unfamiliar environment, Riley, expertly pouring tea into an exquisite cup, replied respectfully that the gentleman was still asleep and usually woke only for meals, reserving the morning for rest and reflection, which seemed to be his habit. His hand, confidently pointing to a cup of tea on the table for her to take, showed that the drink was not only hot, but also aromatic, promising comfort in this first moment of her stay in her new home. Calendia, turning her head towards the butler, quietly asked if there was anything she could ask for, because questions were already beginning to arise in her soul about what she could do to feel more confident and comfortable in this new place. Finding herself in this situation, the noblewoman asked permission to go to the kitchen, where, taking a board and a knife, she began to cut food, doing an unusual job for her, which seemed like a way to get rid of anxiety and take the first step towards mastering a new world. Riley was completely stunned that such a beautiful and refined woman was engaged in such a simple and even peasant task as cutting food, which, as it turned out, helped her calm down, absorbing her thoughts and worries. Pointing her finger at the remains of the carrots, Calendia asked with a slight reproach not to throw them away, because in her opinion, they could still be useful. And this request of hers made the servants cry out in surprise, not expecting such care for food scraps. The food cooking in the pot smelled pleasant, filling the kitchen with aromas that would comfort any soul, and the sound of the ingredients simmering created an atmosphere of homeliness and tranquility, despite the strangeness of this new beginning. After tasting a piece of the food, Calendia quietly muttered something under her breath, involuntarily wondering what exactly the Duke might like and whether his taste preferences would coincide with her own. Thoughtfully, with a slight squint, Riley began to list all the dishes that were usually served to the Duke, among which almost everyone was meat, which made Calendia genuinely surprised. This made the lady laugh, saying that the Duke must have a really strong stomach to be able to digest such a quantity of meat without feeling any ill effects, as she could hardly cope with it. The people stood frozen, face to face, as if each of them were a frozen statue, and suddenly a noise came from far away that made them alert, as if something important was about to happen. Suddenly, the door swung open, and another person joined them, a young man with short black hair, in rumpled clothes, disheveled as if he had just woken up, giving the impression of being completely unprepared for what awaited him. It was an incredibly handsome young man, who looked at the lady in front of him in surprise, not immediately understanding who she was, and his gaze betrayed questions that he never had time to ask, leaving the air filled with uncertainty. The servants discussed the noble's family affairs among themselves, whispering quietly about how they were handling their tasks even as the family enjoyed their dinner, and their words were filled with hidden respect and caution. The head of the family, contented and relaxed, drank wine, feeling triumphantly happy that they had managed to get rid of unnecessary worries, having thrown their stepdaughter out of the house and deprived her of what could once have been a part of her in this life. Isabella happily clung to her father, hugging him with a sparkle in her eyes, declaring that she urgently needed a new dress for the upcoming ball to look like a real beauty and impress everyone with her appearance. The maiden was full of dreams and hopes, because she sincerely wanted to marry a handsome and rich young man, so that her life would become as carefree as she imagined, full of luxury and happiness. But behind closed doors, in the privacy of her room, Isabella, with an evil smile on her lips, bitterly hated her bad sister, cursing her for everything she had, and wishing her only the worst, because she could not forgive her existence. Since childhood, when Calendia appeared, with her snow-white skin and silky hair, Isabella could not hide her feeling of envy, which grew every day, becoming more painful and irresistible. Isabella couldn't help but compare her sister to the princesses she often read about in children's books, because Calendia, who seemed perfect to her, resembled these idealized images, full of beauty and perfection. The lady clenched her teeth in anger and disappointment, realizing that everything she had worked so hard to achieve, her sister had gotten easily simply by right of her birth, without making the slightest effort to become a part of this world. Moreover, Calendia always looked noble and dignified, despite all the pain that Isabella caused her, not allowing any external circumstances to overshadow her inner strength and confidence. Her cold blue eyes, like two stars, never lost their sparkle and pride, despite all the trials that befell her, and they continued to radiate a calm determination as a symbol of her unconquered soul. As she passed the vase of flowers, Isabella thought vindictively that she would not allow her sister to be happier than she was. And another dark thought arose in her heart: how to hurt the one who, in her opinion, would be the cause of her own failures. Frozen in front of the handsome young man across from her, Calendia looked at him in bewilderment, not understanding who he was and why her gaze was so attracted to this stranger, filling her soul with questions and uncertainty. Suddenly, noticing something strange in his appearance, the noblewoman recoiled from the guy, as if she sensed danger or something that made her wary, as if everything around her became somehow alien and unrecognizable. Barely holding back her tears, the lady asked him sympathetically if he was not in pain at all, because her heart was filled with pity and care, seeing in him someone who, despite his resilience, was also subject to suffering, like her. The man stared at his interlocutor with surprise and incomprehension. His gaze was full of confusion, as if he could not believe what he was hearing, and his face expressed bewilderment, as if he found himself in some kind of nightmare from which he could not escape. She pointed her finger at the blade sticking out of the boy's belly, and her gesture was so unexpected and revealing that it seemed as if the entire world around them froze in an oppressive silence when this moment became the center of their attention. The butler and the nobleman, shocked by what was happening, froze in shock, not knowing how to react to these alarming words. Their hearts stopped from fear, and their minds tried to understand what exactly was happening in this strange and dangerous situation. Calendia closed her eyes in surprise when the handsome man grabbed her hands, not giving her a chance to dodge, and pulled her towards him with such force that her breath stopped and her heart beat faster from fear and strange excitement. The man's fiery eyes widened, and his voice, filled with rage and pain, became loud. He shouted, questioning his companion if she really saw the blade sticking out of his stomach. His questions sounded like a challenge, leaving no room for doubt. The butler, noticing that the situation was becoming increasingly tense, quickly intervened, asking Mr. Arno to calm down, realizing that his actions had frightened the lady so much that she could hardly control herself at that moment. It turned out that this young man was Duke Arno Cristo, a rich and handsome nobleman whose name was known in the highest circles and whose face was adorned with a mysterious aura that hid many secrets of his past. Sitting on the sofas at the table, the nobles discussed the topic of immortality. Their conversation was full of deep thoughts and philosophical questions, where everyone tried to express their opinion. But everyone, it seemed, could not answer the main question that stood before them. Finding herself in the center of this conversation, Calendia learned that 50 years ago, this guy had lived through all the horrors of war, consumed by bloody events that left scars in his soul, and the memory of that time became a terrible and painful reminder for him. Unable to bear the horror when houses began to burn before his eyes, the man's hands unconsciously grabbed the blade to escape from reality, deciding to say goodbye to life. But something kept him from this step, leaving pain and bitterness of loss in his soul. Calendia, realizing the terrible ordeal the man in front of her had gone through, looked at him with sympathy, her heart filled with compassion and pity as she saw in his eyes a reflection of pain that was alien to her own experience. Weeping, the lady covered her mouth with her hand as she listened to the story of the Duke who was cursed for his sin, punished with immortality, which became an unbearable burden on his soul, forever depriving him of peace and the opportunity to get rid of eternal pain. The hand squeezed her heart like strong chains that wrapped around her soul, filling her with a sense of pain and doom, as Ta understood that there was no way to liberation and that the curse was her own inevitable fate. The noblewoman's eyes reflected deep sadness and longing, and bitter memories surfaced in her soul, filling her heart with heaviness and pain, because she could not forget those moments when her world was destroyed by the loss of loved ones and loneliness. She remembered standing alone among the graves in the cemetery where her parents were buried, their stone images immortalized in cold stone, as if they had left no trace, no consolation, leaving her alone with the shadow of their sorrow. Looking at her reflection in her teacup, the girl froze, caught off guard when she heard that there was a way to lift the curse from the Duke. And this thought, like a bright flash, pierced her mind, causing a wave of emotions and vague hope. With a serious and determined expression on his face, the handsome man said that it was Calendia that was the key that opened the way to freedom for him, and it was his only hope for salvation, despite all the difficulties. The aristocrat, shocked by his words, froze in complete shock, realizing that except for her, no one else in this world had seen this ancient and dangerous blade, possessing extraordinary power and secrets. The Duke, with the evident intention of remedying the situation, turned to the lady opposite, begging her to finally remove this weapon from his hands and give him assistance, since without it, he could not move forward. Calendia, feeling inner doubt, was ready to lend a helping hand to the Duke. But before acting, she decided to ask him what would happen to him after she intervened and how it would change his destiny. Quietly, almost in a whisper, the aristocrat spoke words that hung in the air, with a heavy, gloomy intonation, informing her that if she helped him, he would disappear from this world, leaving without a trace, as if he had never existed. The girl did not feel joy from the fact that she became a murderer, even at the will and desire of her companion, because such a decision was too difficult for her, even despite his request. The nobleman and his butler waited impatiently for the decision of the noblewoman sitting opposite them, looking intently into her face, trying to understand what choice she would make and how it would affect their future. Calendia, without losing her resolve, declared with a firm look that she was ready to help her future husband, but not at this moment, realizing that such decisions require the right moment and preparation. After all, if she agreed right now, she would immediately be returned back to the family that hated her, taking her for someone else's unacceptable daughter, which became an unbearable thought for her. The woman's hands tightly clutched the fabric of her dress, as if trying to hold all her emotions and thoughts inside, not allowing herself to show weakness in front of those who were waiting for her decision. Stretching her hand forward, she explained in a reserved manner that once she killed the guy, she could consider herself dead, because for her, this act would be the end of her old life, which had no meaning after this act. In a loud and confident voice, the noblewoman declared that let the aristocrat become her husband, but only after that she would fulfill his will, ready to fulfill her promise, but without losing her pride and dignity. Christo, attentively following every word, looked calmly at the lady, without showing the slightest concern, as if his own experiences and feelings had long since faded into the shadow of her determination. After which, tired, he sprawled out without ceremony, spreading his legs in an unseemly manner, and with a dejected expression on his face, asked how much longer he had to live, as if his fate had already been decided. Stretching his arms upward, he complained with obvious regret that he had already lived almost 50 years, and that was a long time, although his life, in his opinion, had long since lost all meaning, leaving only fatigue and disappointment. Suddenly, Calendia, unable to bear it any longer, stood up and loudly slammed her hands on the table, attracting everyone's attention, decisively expressing her displeasure and determination not to leave his words unanswered. With fury and full confidence, she screamed, "Why then did this man decide to get married at all, if he dreamed of death so much, not understanding how one could hope for a bright future, continuing to live in such a state?" The man's hand slowly reached forward, asking the lady to stop, not to continue this conversation. His face expressed a mixture of weariness and resignation, as if he was no longer ready to fight her words. Bewildered, with obvious displeasure, he asked again what exactly she meant by making such a sharp and painful phrase, not understanding what meaning she was trying to put into these words. Sitting at the table, the nobles began to discuss that in fact it was the decree of the prince himself, who decided to marry the noblewoman to the duke, and everyone's understanding looks indicated that the decision was made without hesitation, despite the internal tension. The butler, without showing any unnecessary emotion, confirmed these assumptions with just one glance. His face remained calm, but his eyes showed slight concern, and his flushed forehead betrayed the tension that he could not hide. Christo, unable to hide his displeasure, turned away, putting his hand to his face as if trying to cover up his dislike for the decision of the royal personage, who, in his opinion, did not take into account all the circumstances, making such a hasty and cruel decision. On the balcony of a large palace stood a man, confidently leaning on the railing, his gaze directed into the distance, and he seemed to enjoy the moment, perceiving everything around him as a kind of stage on which he had a special role. Ferdinand, the prince with a broad smile, stood with majesty, his face shining with confidence, and, waving his hand affably to the assembled people, he showed his readiness for new achievements, as if not noticing the possible contradictions in what was happening. Moreover, Ferdinand was also the grandson of the previous ruler, who fought in the war side by side with the duke, and their friendship was strong despite the cruel trials of those years, which left a deep mark on the history of the kingdom. The previous ruler, having learned of the curse that had fallen on his friend's shoulders, swore an oath to help him, despite all the risks and the hardships of fate, as he respected his friendship and was ready to support him, without thinking about the possible consequences. However, over time, he grew old, and realizing that his strength was no longer what it had been, he passed on his promise to his son, and later to his grandson, hoping that they would be able to fulfill his oath and worthily deal with what remained unresolved. Christo, lost in thought, could not understand how the prince could have come up with the idea of marrying him to someone, because it all seemed completely absurd and contradictory to him, given their complex relationship and his own views on life. Riley expressed sympathy for his master, who seemed to be in deep shock from such news, and his face reflected the full weight of what he had perceived, as if he himself could not believe what had happened, despite his outward calm. Christo, slightly bowing his head, replied that there was no need to apologize, since in his eyes there was nothing that was worth justifying, especially since his thoughts were occupied with much more important questions than any attempt at an apology. Eventually, Christo admitted to himself that he never read the prince's letters, which were constantly lying on his desk, leaving behind only a headache from their content and a feeling that the time spent reading them was wasted. Suddenly, the man froze, looking in surprise at the spoon, which he had already raised to his lips, as if forgetting about his thoughts and feelings, concentrating all his attention on this moment, which turned out to be unexpectedly significant. The soup that stood in a bowl on the table was not only aromatic, but also incredibly tasty. Its smell, mixing with the air, gave comfort and a sense of peace, temporarily distracting from more serious thoughts. Riley raised his fist in the air in joy, and proudly declared that the young lady had prepared this dish, and that was why it was so unusual, with a special taste that could be immediately distinguished from anything he had tried before. Suddenly, Kalendia intervened in the conversation, bowing her head down and asking doubtfully what would happen to her now, what her next steps were, because her future remained uncertain, and she did not know what awaited her in this world. She put her hands to her chest and loudly declared that she was ready to do anything to avoid claiming the role of countess, ready to serve if necessary, but not wanting to return to her father's house, where her fate would be predictable and depressingly strict. Christo, observing her behavior, noticed how desperate his so-called bride was, because her words and actions, full of determination and fear, seemed to him to be a reflection of her internal struggle and misunderstanding of her own situation. With a small, barely noticeable smile on his face, he slowly asked his interlocutor what she meant, and suggested that she introduce herself first before continuing the conversation, realizing that her words needed further clarification. Waving his hand to the side and taking a deep breath, Christo explained that since the lady was the only one who could lift the curse from him, he was not going to let her go so easily, because it was not only his wish, but also his last hope for deliverance from his torment. The food before him was aromatic and delicious, the spices blending perfectly, filling the air with their spicy, inviting atmosphere, as if each bite had been carefully prepared with love and attention. The girl was happy with such an offer, standing opposite her future husband. Her face expressed gratitude, and at the same time some excitement, since such words from him were unexpected for her and perhaps a fateful moment. Her hand was stretched forward, and her long fingers were frozen in anticipation, as if she was waiting for the next step that would determine her future destiny and bring something new and important into her life that she could not miss. The handsome man, smiling a kind and confident smile, invited her to stay with him until her death. His words sounded soft, but with a slight hint of determination, as if this request was not just a wish, but a necessity for both. Calendia, after a short pause, accepted the offer without thinking twice, and finally introduced herself by her name, reservedly, but with sincere respect, as if emphasizing the importance of the moment and her readiness to go further on this difficult path. She made a polite curtsy, adding that she was pleased to meet them. Her manners were refined, and her voice was quiet but confident, which gave her a special grace and attractiveness in the eyes of her interlocutors. She whirled around the room in delight, admiring the luxury and exquisite furniture. Every decoration in the interior seemed to her like a work of art, creating an atmosphere of grandeur that she so wanted to feel throughout her life. The beauty was deeply impressed by the fact that a special room was allocated for her, and she felt how this small but significant change was changing her life, like a ray of light in the dark tunnel of her past, which she had endured for so long. Before that, she had spent her entire life in a cold closet, where cobwebs hung in the air and dust settled on everything around her, turning every corner into an uncomfortable place that became more and more uninhabitable with each passing day. The little girl was dressed in old rags instead of real clothes, which hardly protected her from the piercing cold, but she was used to it, and her body was hardened by the difficult conditions that seemed to her familiar and inevitable. The Duke, noticing her reaction, asked if his bride liked the room, and his voice sounded caring, as if he wanted to make sure that he did everything to make her feel at least a little happy. Despite everything she had been through, tears appeared in the beauty's eyes, like an irresistible stream of emotions that burst out, and this was the moment when her soul was finally able to let go of all the burden of fear and pain that had accumulated over many years. Blinking back tears, she muttered with a smile that she liked everything very much, and despite her modest words, there was genuine gratitude in her voice, and she herself felt how a small miracle was beginning to change her perception of the world and her life. Suddenly, Calendia froze in front of her future husband when he insistently asked her what she wanted to say, and her gaze became hesitant, as if the words were stuck somewhere on her tongue, unable to break out, despite her desire to express everything she thought. Riley, standing next to her, truly understood the situation and, noticing her confusion, smiled politely, realizing that at this moment he was superfluous, since everything that happened was personal and should remain between young people. He bowed politely, deciding to leave them alone as he felt they needed privacy to sort out their thoughts and feelings without being subjected to outside interference and stares. The Duke was finally left alone with the lady, and despite the tension of the moment, there was a silence that seemed almost ominous around the two of them until they both found the strength to continue the conversation, after which Christo turned to the noblewoman and repeated his question, asking again what she wanted from him, and his voice sounded calm, but with a slight hint of insistence, as if he was waiting for an answer that would finally clarify their future. The girl began to mumble shyly, asking if the noble would feel pain while the blade remained in his stomach. Her words were quiet and uncertain, but there was something painfully sincere in them, as if she had already accepted her fate, but could not get rid of her fear. The red-handled sword was pierced into his body, and despite this, Christo did not show the slightest sign of pain. His face remained calm and his gaze focused, as if everything that was happening was just a part of some much larger picture. Looking down at the sword, Christo confidently stated that it did not hurt him. His voice sounded firm and decisive, as if he was already accustomed to such trials, and the process itself was not something unexpected for him. Suddenly, the weapon began to glow, as if the very power contained within the blade began to emit magical energy, filling the space with a mysterious aura that made the air around tremble with an invisible force. The handsome man, as if not paying attention to the miracles that had happened to the blade, waved his hand, and the blade disappeared, dissolving into thin air as if it had never existed. There was no point in showing the weapon anymore, since it had already played its role. Instead, a long magical sword appeared in the man's hand, sparkling with a mysterious light. Its hilt was decorated with complex patterns, and the weapon itself emitted magical energy that seemed to be able to cut through the space around it. The noblewoman could not contain her delight and began to clap her hands, admiring this display of strength and skill. Her eyes glowed, and her heart filled with surprise and respect for the one who possessed such a powerful force. Christo, in turn, began to boast that with this sword he could easily cut not only the wind, but also the sky itself. His voice sounded confident and proud, as if he was confident in his invincibility and could conquer any expanse, whatever it might be. Suddenly, a woman's hands gripped a man's tightly and tenderly. Her touch was gentle but full of determination, and there was a strength in those hands that lifted his spirit and at the same time made his heart skip a beat with anticipation. Kalendia asked her future husband to lend her his sword for a while. Her voice was calm, but there was such determination in it that he could not help but react, realizing that her desire was sincere and important to her, no matter how strange it seemed. The bird sang its songs, filling the air with the sounds of nature, which created a feeling of harmony and calm, as if everything around froze to allow these two moments to become something important, even magical. And this was accompanied by a light rustling of the wind in the leaves. The nobleman placed his hand on the blade of the sword, and blue magic began to swirl around it, as if the very power hidden within the weapon was coming to life and responding to his touch, creating a mesmerizing glow. The blade cuts through the air with each swing, creating a shining magic around itself. Its magical energy, as if coming to life, smoothly filled the space, and the tip of the sword easily cut the air, leaving behind a trail of light and power. The lady standing next to him cried out in joy, admiring how skillfully the swordsman began to chop the grass. Her voice was full of delight, as if she was witnessing a true miracle, despite the fact that before them was only ordinary work with the earth. The man thought to himself with displeasure that he was forced to use the blade for such a trifle, internally resenting himself, because he was used to big and important tasks, and not to such insignificant matters that seemed not to deserve his efforts and power. As she tore grass with her hands, Kalendia explained that she had noticed how untidy the yard looked from her window and had decided to fix it. Her words were full of determination, as if she would do anything to transform the space around her and create order. The grass was high, blocking the paths in places, and weeds mixed with the greenery, creating a neglected and unkempt appearance that clearly did not correspond to the status of the palace. And so Kalendia decided to change everything, correcting this deficiency with her own hands. Riley had known his master since childhood. They had walked through this garden as children, and for him, this place was associated with many memories of games and laughter together, of simple joys that seemed eternal in those days. With a smile, the maiden said that she wanted to revive this garden because the butler had many good memories associated with it, and it was important to her to bring back a piece of that atmosphere that once made it special, filled with warmth and happiness. Christo smiled as he thought about how amazing and unexpected his bride was. His gaze became softer, and his heart seemed to warm up as he saw in her something he had not expected. Something more than just the woman destined to be his wife. Suddenly, Kalendia stopped, drawing attention to what had happened to the Duke's clothes. She noticed that her future husband had become a little dirty. His outfit was not as impeccable as usual, which did not seem to suit his status. The aristocrat, noticing her anxiety, asked the girl not to worry about the fact that he could get dirty. His voice was calm. He did not attach much importance to the disorder, believing that the true meaning is not the appearance, but what is happening inside. Extending his hand forward, he firmly stated that he was going to help the noblewoman, his gesture full of determination and confidence, as if he was ready to overcome any obstacles to support her in her aspirations and plans. The young couple walked down the hallway of the mansion, their footsteps echoing off the long painted walls, creating a sense of grandeur and silence that was broken only by their conversation and the light sound of their footsteps. Unlike the joyful lady, the Duke felt tired. His body was burdened with the weight of labor, and he could hardly stand on his feet, as if every step was taken with effort, and his thoughts were occupied not only with past affairs, but also with what still had to be done. The aristocrats stopped near the butler, who was busy with household chores, checking something, performing his duties smoothly and confidently, while his movements were quick and precise, not paying attention to the noise around him. Riley, who was carrying a heavy box of things, greeted the lady politely. His words were sincere, but he clearly felt the weight of his load, because the box was filled with various items that required careful handling and caution. Putting the box on the floor, the butler admitted that he could not find the recipe for the cookies that the beauty wanted to make. His face expressed slight concern, because he was trying to fulfill her request. But the problem with the recipe became an unexpected obstacle. The girl also stopped, realizing that the search would drag on. When her gaze fell on the disorder in the room, drowning in junk that had not received attention for a long time, and various objects were scattered everywhere, creating the impression of abandonment. With enthusiasm and a genuine desire to help, Calendia asked if there was any way she could help Riley, feeling that she could contribute to cleaning or any other task that was ahead of them, despite the mess in the place. The butler raised his hands up, claiming that the help was not necessary. He did not want to bother the lady once again, but his words sounded with slight regret, because he felt uncomfortable accepting help, despite the obvious need for it. Calendia, despite his refusal, was determined to help the servants. Her determination was obvious, and she added with a broad smile that the three of them would definitely cope with any task that lay ahead of them, because coordinated work always brings results. The hand in the black sleeve smoothly dropped to the floor. Its movements were confident and collected, as if she had long been accustomed to solving problems with the same calm and determination as in any other situation where her help was needed. The Duke, despite his desire to quickly dive into the water and rest, still helped to put things away, realizing that it was necessary to complete the task before allowing himself to rest, since it was his duty as the owner to ensure order in the house. The noblewoman, observing his actions, came quietly and gently, told him that they were obliged to help Riley, for he was already old and could easily get a hernia from heavy loads, which could lead to long suffering and complications. With a heavy sigh and a slightly annoyed expression on his face, Christo stated that Riley was actually several years younger than him, and despite his apparent old age, he was still in much better shape than it might appear at first glance. Calendia, picking up one of the books in her hands, asked with interest and curiosity what kind of work it was. Her gaze focused on it, trying to figure out the title or features of the book that caught her attention. Once in front of it, the girl discovered that it was a photo album, and the title on the cover, although faded and partially erased, was still visible, telling of something meaningful that might interest her, given the content and personal memories. The book was open to one of its pages, and before my eyes, a whole gallery opened up, filled with both texts and many photographs, each of which hid a special story, full of emotions and memories. One of these photographs showed two men, one a young Riley and the other a Duke, whose faces radiated strength and confidence, leaving a lasting impression. Calendia, upon seeing the photograph, could not contain her joy and began to enthusiastically talk about how beautiful the young servant in the picture was, striking with her admiration and genuine perception of beauty. The Duke, hearing her words, involuntarily twisted his lips into a displeased grimace, because he was convinced that he himself was an unsurpassed handsome man and could not allow anyone else to steal his attention. However, when attention was drawn to one of the photographs where Christo was smiling, it became clear that he really looked truly charming and lovely, as if nature itself had taken care of his perfect appearance. Calendia noticed how unusually quiet the man became. His gaze became more thoughtful, and she, sensing the alarming silence, called his name, trying to bring him back to reality. Suddenly, as if startled by something, he jumped up from his spot, quickly getting to his feet as if preparing to leave immediately, leaving Calendia confused by his sudden reaction. Several days passed, and the mansion, simple yet elegant, continued to stand among the brick walls, modestly and with impeccable taste, quietly listening to the noise of the outside world, which never disturbed its peace. Sitting, Christo thoughtfully thought about what kind of guests might come to them at such a late hour, because such a late visit always carries with it some kind of vague threat or importance, leaving an atmosphere of uncertainty in the air. Riley, noticing the approach of the guests, bowed before them with reverence, before announcing that important people had come to see them, clearly emphasizing the significance of the moment and the upcoming meeting, which added solemnity to what was happening. As Christo rudely ordered the men to be sent outside the gate and focused on his meal again, a man suddenly burst in, shouting loudly about how cruel his friend was, attracting the attention of everyone present. The lady, hearing this unexpected cry, froze in surprise, unable to understand what was happening and who this person was, whose behavior was so provocative and strange. This man turned out to be the prince himself, who, despite the noise and confusion, joyfully waved his hand in greeting, as if nothing could disturb his carefree mood, and he was absolutely confident in his right. Rising from her seat, the lady made a gesture of deep respect to the princess, imagining how she should greet the royal person so as not to violate etiquette, not forgetting all the necessary formalities. The guy, noticing her efforts, smiled amiably and asked that everything be done without unnecessary formalities, preferring casual communication, standing next to the table and demonstrating his intentions to remain on an equal footing with the others. Approaching the Duke, Ferdinand, with a serious expression on his face, declared that in fact he had not come here for the festivities, but to celebrate the wedding of his friend, thereby emphasizing the importance of the moment. On the table in front of them stood a delicious piece of cake with strawberries and delicate cream, which seemed to perfectly match the atmosphere of the festive event, inviting everyone to enjoy this little pleasure. The prince, sitting down next to the butler, continued to congratulate the Duke, praising him for finding himself a beautiful bride who, among other things, could free him from a terrible curse, which made this union even more significant. Winking at the Duke, Ferdinand expected him to express gratitude for his help in the matchmaking, confident that his efforts had been decisive in uniting two hearts and restoring old traditions. After this, he gratefully thanked the servants for the tea and cakes they had served, appreciating their care and attention to detail in preparing for such an important event that he was going to celebrate with his friends. The four of them sat at the table enjoying the delicious food, and the atmosphere was filled with comfort and tranquility as everyone devoured their dishes, enjoying the moment and the conversation. Suddenly, the prince, as if remembering something important, suddenly fell silent. His gaze became focused, and he began to hastily search for one thing among his faithful things, as if something unfinished required his attention. The prince, with a slight smile on his face, took a carefully folded letter from his pocket, his fingers touching the paper as if emphasizing the importance of this moment, and declared that soon it would be his grandfather's birthday, an event that had always been important to their family. Still smiling, he added that the young couple who were present at this table were also on the guest list, which only emphasized the importance of their role in the future celebration, creating an atmosphere of sophistication and attention to each guest. The noblewoman, hearing these words, froze. Her eyes widened in surprise when she saw the letter in the prince's hands. It turned out to be an invitation to the castle, which meant for them participation in such an important event that would bring many new opportunities and acquaintances. At this time of year, when nobles went to balls in luxurious carriages with horses, the atmosphere was filled with anticipation. Each ball was an important moment in high circles, where only the most worthy found themselves, and life seemed full of events. Herself, sitting by the window behind the bars, absorbed in her thoughts, quietly observed the outside world, her gaze as if riveted to what was happening outside her room, to those possibilities that she could only dream of. The girl was truly surprised that it was the prince who personally delivered this invitation to her, because such a gesture seemed to hide something more than just an official invitation, and excitement arose in her heart. After that, she slightly bowed her head towards her future husband, looking into his face, with the hope that he would answer this question, because she could not predict how he would react and what he would say in response to the prince's words. With a broad smile on his face, the prince recalled that in previous years, the Duke had always responded with good nature and patience. But now, unfortunately, he could no longer do this, and his response no longer had the same ease as before. But at that moment, as if to destroy all expectations, Christo rudely refused, curbing any hopes of the interlocutor, so that all his efforts were brought to naught, and the tension in the room immediately increased. There was a dessert on a fork in front of him, but the man, ignoring the treat, explained that the prince was extremely annoying and unforgiving, creating an atmosphere of irritation around himself that was gradually beginning to take over. As a last resort, the prince turned to the Duke's future wife, hoping that she would support him in this matter and perhaps find a way to change the man's attitude so that the situation would not become even more tense. The request was clear: to persuade Christo, who, sitting on a chair, turned away and demonstratively did not want to go to the ball, despite all the persuasion and attempts to convince him of the importance of this event, which he clearly did not want to attend. With a forced smile and a blush on her cheeks, The lady, in a moment when her thoughts were a little confused, thought that perhaps she was not the one who could replace the Duke's mother, and her words might not have the effect she expected. She awkwardly began to try to persuade her husband, claiming that he had not seen his old friend for a long time, although she knew perfectly well that this friend was no longer young, and such a meeting could be something important for both. Although the Duke was not at all delighted with the idea, pointing his finger at the Duke, the prince, without hiding his mockery, called him stupid, emphasizing that he was incapable of understanding the full importance of the moment, as if experiencing some kind of superiority in his view of what was happening. Not wanting to give in, Ferdinand clapped his hands loudly, declaring with determination that it would still be as he said, since his opinion was final and no one could change his decision, creating an atmosphere of tension and self-righteousness in the room. At that very moment, servants began to enter the room, carrying things, a carpet and chests, creating an atmosphere of some kind of readiness for change, and each of their steps was filled with some kind of importance, as if something important was being prepared. Christo asked inquiringly, with obvious bewilderment, what the young man was up to and what exactly was being brought inside, because his eyes were looking for an explanation for this restless movement, which was clearly connected with some kind of change. Ferdinand easily explained that until the Duke agreed to his proposal, he would remain living with him because his grandfather would be very upset if the prince returned with bad news, which could lead to tension and upset in the family. After this, Ferdinand smiled broadly, his teeth were even, and his expression was satisfied and confident, as if he was completely confident in his brilliant plan, which, in his opinion, would definitely bring the desired result. The nature around, the silence of the gazebo where the young people were sitting inside, created an atmosphere of calm and peace, while all the events taking place inside the mansion seemed distant and not so significant. The prince drank tea with pleasure, enjoying every sip, which brought not only warmth, but also satisfaction from the moment when a calm atmosphere reigned around, filled with the aroma of a freshly brewed drink. The tea, served in an exquisite cup, pleased not only with its taste, but also with its aroma, which excited every corner of the room, creating an indescribable feeling of comfort and peace, which this drink always brought at such moments. While talking with the Duke, the boy admired the good weather, which seemed to have a positive effect on his mood, and the whole world seemed ideal, as if time had stopped, and worries and anxieties had faded into the background. Christo agreed that everything was fine, but still noted that the only thing that marred the picture was the presence of the heir to the throne of the empire, whose presence seemed to remind of the inevitability of changes that could affect the future. Wiping away fake tears, Ferdinand, with a dramatic intonation, called the Duke a cruel man, as if trying to emphasize the discrepancy between his actions and virtues, which added piquancy to the conversation. And at that moment, when the tension reached its peak, the sword was put to the guy's throat, which was an unexpected turn of events, because he rarely thought about the consequences of his words. But, as it turned out, sometimes he spoke without thinking, which led to such situations. The evil aristocrat, with obvious contempt and a hint of threat in his voice, demanded that the prince repeat his words, realizing that disobedience could lead to serious consequences, and his power did not tolerate objections. Ferdinand, a little shocked, raised his hands in front of him in a gesture of submission, and, immediately changing his tone to a more polite and restrained one, tried to please the Duke, fearing that his anger could lead to unpleasant consequences, even pain. Suddenly, a lady in a red hat, with her hair neatly braided, walked past them with her graceful and light step, and her presence immediately attracted attention both by her beauty and by her demeanor. The lady was Calendia, who usually spent her time tending the flowers in the garden, and she gratefully accepted the invitation to tea, approaching them with a friendly smile and an expression of sincere appreciation for their attention. With a smile on her face and a slight bow, Calendia promised to join them for tea as soon as she had finished her work of replanting the roses in the garden, to tidy them up and treat the eye to their beauty. The guys, unable to contain their amazement, watched her hard work and persistence, how she confidently and lovingly did her job. And it was hard for them to believe that such a refined lady could be so devoted to her work. With joy and a little delight, Christo explained that Calendia had tried to revive the garden, sparing no effort, and making every effort to restore its former beauty. turning each flower bed into a small work of art. Ferdinand, with sincere admiration, could not help but agree with him and added that this lady was truly an amazing person whose strength of spirit and energy were inspiring, despite her gentle and refined appearance. After all, at the recent ball, among the noble aristocrats, they often said that their adopted daughter was weak and unable to even leave the house on her own, considering her fragile and sickly, not foreshadowing anything special in her. Frowning and with a slight contempt in his voice, Christo resolutely rejected all these rumors, because Calendia was a real strong woman, full of energy, striving to always be on top, and no opinion could change this fact. He turned to his interlocutor, confidently assuming that he was mistaken, and perhaps had mixed something up or had not understood the real essence, because everything that was said about Calendia was absolutely not true. Ferdinand, answering confidently, declared that there was no mistake, since Calendia had never appeared among the aristocrats, which made her invisible to their social life, and had never crossed these circles. Christo fell silent, lost in his thoughts, sipping his tea, as his mind was busy thinking about the words he had just spoken. There were moments that would not leave his head, causing slight confusion and doubt. The noblewoman, strangely and carefree, traveled alone, without any companions, and there was no one who cared about her well-being, as if she were a whole world unto herself, of no use to anyone. The food she prepared was so delicious that it seemed like the embodiment of culinary art, and this was surprising, because usually aristocrats did not cook food, leaving it to the maids. With his head down and absorbed in his thoughts, Christo began to realize that Calendia seemed reluctant to return home, and this strange detail began to make him increasingly suspicious. When asked if he liked the girl, Christo, leaning back in his chair and closing his eyes, confidently and firmly stated that he didn't like anyone, not hiding his reluctance to discuss this topic. The prince, offended and puffed up, said with a touch of sarcasm that at this rate the duke's heart would dry up completely, no longer capable of experiencing any feelings or affection, as if it had already dried up from long suffering. The man, steadfastly sticking to his opinion, replied that he was not going to start a relationship with anyone, emphasizing his determination not to give in to anyone's persuasion or pressure in matters of his personal life. Christo was not at all interested in this beauty, especially since she herself had previously stated the same thing during their previous meeting, as if it was just empty curiosity that had no further continuation. The guy, slightly lost in thought, looked at his reflection in the cup of tea, watching how the vibrations of the water and the light circles reflected his face, in which, perhaps, all his doubts and thoughts were hidden. Ultimately, she will raise her sword and kill the duke, with a determination and fury that will leave no doubt as to her intentions, for her choice will be irrevocable and inevitable. With a firm look and complete determination, Christo declared that he did not need more from her, emphasizing his conviction that their relationship was not capable of developing into something more. 50 years ago, when war claimed the lives of many, blood mixed with mud and stomach pain became a constant reminder that human suffering had no end in this endless conflict. The man ordered the other to stop, asking with cold curiosity where he was going, as if that question was the most important thing that could be asked in their current situation. The houses were in chaos and destruction, as if the world around them had collapsed and the remnants of former harmony had been carried away by the storm, leaving only disorder and desolation that could not be repaired. A hand, bloody and trembling with excitement, stretched forward, as if trying to stop something invisible, but completely inevitable, in the expectation that its gesture would have at least the slightest influence on what was happening. A voice coming from behind sarcastically called the Duke an unhappy man, and before he could respond, a powerful male hand grabbed him by the clothes, throwing him aside like a doll, leaving no chance for resistance. Letting out a loud roar, Christo turned angrily towards the stranger, who stood before him, wanting to know his identity, ready to burst into rage at any moment due to his deep dissatisfaction. With a slight smile, the man adjusted his cap, giving himself confidence, and introduced himself as the god of death, assuring that from now on, he would become the main enemy of the Duke, whose fate was now inexorably linked to his own decision. Before the aristocrat could say anything, the boy confidently declared that Christo's name was not on the list of the dead today, leaving the Duke fully confident that his life had not yet come to an end. Coldly, With a hint of indifference, he added that if the Duke died that day, he would not be able to save those to whom he was indebted, and his death would be not only his personal tragedy, but also the death of others. On the roads, flames mercilessly devoured buildings. The fire, tearing apart the night silence, mercilessly devoured everything in its path, as if the world itself had decided to burn and forget about the people it was once obliged to protect. The shocked, handsome man looked up, and his face showed amazement, which was visible in his eyes. He was so shocked by the words spoken out loud that he could hardly believe what was happening. The god of death recoiled in surprise when he heard that the Duke didn't care about the fates of other people. His indifference to the suffering of others was shocking, and this opened up unexpected horizons for manipulation before him. With indifference hanging his head, he added that now he no longer had any reason to live. For having lost everything that could give him a purpose, he saw no continuation for himself in this world filled with empty hopes. The aristocrat's enemy, with contempt in his voice, called him a fool, as if laughing at his naivety and weakness, and clearly not feeling the slightest respect for his status and position in society. Sitting down next to him, he said with barely restrained contempt that the Duke had brought a grave sin upon himself by refusing to save others, despite the fact that he had such an opportunity and he could have changed the course of events. His hand gripped tightly the chain that wrapped tightly around the handsome man's heart, squeezing his soul like a symbol of the immutable curse hanging over him because of his own decisions. Thus, the god of death imposed an inevitable curse on the Duke, immortality, which became his painful lot, forcing him to live in an endless struggle with his own soul, imprisoned in the body. Adjusting his headdress, the man walked away with a cold determination in his eyes, as if he was sure that his words would leave an unhealed wound in the Duke's soul, and everything would develop according to his scenario. Before leaving, he explained that only the one who saw the sword sticking out of the handsome man's stomach could save him and lift the curse, but only if he decided to take this risk, overcoming his own destiny. Time passed, and the city continued to live its usual life. Nobles, busy with their affairs, strolled along the morning streets, enjoying the coolness of the fountains, and the nature around, becoming brighter every day, filled the air with freshness and silence. A figure in a dark blue cloak that hid his face walked silently past the crowd, as if he had disappeared at that moment, and with each step he left behind a feeling of something mysterious and unnoticed, but persistently attracting attention. The nobleman, frozen for a moment, turned around in surprise when the stranger, accidentally catching him with his cloak, stopped, apologized. But something in his gaze made the man feel that this incident was not at all accidental. However, when they met face to face, the aristocrat realized at first glance that in front of him was not just a passerby, but Duke Christo himself, whose presence brought doubts and unexpected experiences into his soul, because he did not expect to see him in such a state. When the man finally left, an elderly couple standing nearby began to discuss the stranger, because his face, although familiar, had not changed over the years, which certainly caught their attention and left many questions in their hearts. Himself was walking down the street, absorbed in his thoughts, but suddenly stopped abruptly when he heard himself called a monster, locked in his mansion, as if imprisoned in a cage in which he was doomed to be. With a smirk on his lips, he leaned against the wall, thinking about the words he had just heard, and thought sadly that he would now have to come to terms with this nickname, with the title of Monster that would follow him everywhere. The boy was so tired of searching for someone who could help him lift the curse that despite endless attempts, he never found anyone who could ease his suffering and give him hope for liberation. He lay down on his pillow, feeling the heaviness of the day gradually disappear, and sank into a half-sleep, where thoughts smoothly flowed into each other, and his body relaxed, almost forgetting about all his worries. That afternoon, when the sun's rays were barely penetrating through the window, he woke up and the first gust of wind quietly rustled the curtain, causing it to flutter, and a slight smell of freshness and change was felt in the air. But at the window stood the aristocrat Calendia, who with a sincere smile wished the Duke good morning, as if her presence filled the room with a light glow and brought a touch of warmth to this early moment. The guy stood up from his seat, crouched down a little, and looked at the beauty in surprise, not expecting her presence to burst into his day so unexpectedly and softly, as if she were part of something more important and unpredictable. During the meal, in addition to the young couple, The prince was also sitting next to them, looking at the exquisite dishes with admiration, enjoying not only the taste of the food, but also the atmosphere in which he found himself, absorbing every moment. Calendia turned to her husband, worried and quiet, with a hint of concern in her voice, asking how the heir to the throne managed to juggle his palace duties while living in someone else's house. It was obviously difficult for the prince to work away from his native castle, in someone else's mansion. But despite this, he continued to work, showing steadfastness and devotion to the cause, which was no less important than his native duties. Christo hastened to reassure the lady, assuring her with words that Ferdinand would soon return back to the castle, as soon as the fatigue from long days of work left him, and then everything would fall into place again. Then, with a slight note of concern in his voice, he asked if Calendia had noticed anything strange that might have escaped her attention, since some things were beginning to seem too unusual to be accidental. The Duke cried out in fear, with confusion in his eyes, when he learned that the prince's things were growing in number and that he seemed to have decided to stay with them, which was alarming, since it could mean much more than just a temporary stay. Calendia, looking uncertainly at her fiancé, asked if perhaps she should seriously consider the prince's proposal and go to the ball, since such a chance could not be missed, and she could not ignore it. It was unlikely that this would happen again. Christo rubbed his forehead thoughtfully, his thoughts becoming much more serious than before as he began to take the lady's words seriously, realizing that the situation they found themselves in required a more careful approach and solution. After all, Ferdinand would not return to the castle until he received the Duke's consent, and now everything depended on his decision, which, in turn, put them all before an important and unexpected choice that could affect the further course of events. If a young couple goes to an event together, they will certainly become the main subject of gossip, and all eyes will be on them, as their presence will be discussed in every corner of the palace and beyond. Calendia, innocent and defenseless, will become the monster's bride, while everyone will watch her fate, inventing the most incredible rumors and accusing her of deciding to be with such a man. Sitting at the table, the Duke was absorbed in thoughts about what he should do next. He was tormented by doubts, not knowing how to act in such a delicate situation, while the palace servant stood nearby, as if awaiting his instructions. Finally, Christo made a decision. He agreed to go to the ball, but without the bride, deciding that perhaps it would be better for everyone, avoiding unnecessary conversations and unnecessary attention that could bring even more problems. The nobles were astonished by this decision, because no one expected that the Duke would dare to take such an unexpected step, and in their eyes, it was not only a daring, but also an extremely important choice that could change the course of events. Ferdinand began to be indignant, because his friend was leaving his wife alone, but then he was interrupted by Calendia, who suddenly jumped up from her seat and put in her word, as if interrupting his entire speech. With a forced smile, but with a hint of sadness, the beauty said that she was used to staying home alone, and therefore was not against this situation, as if she had long since come to terms with loneliness. Everyone was upset by such words from the young maiden, and this feeling weighed down the atmosphere, filling it with some kind of inexpressible regret and sadness, as if they were all witnesses to invisible pain. However, the girl only left, closing the door behind her, and a silence immediately reigned in the dining room, which seemed unbearable and heavy, as if every word remained unshed. Christo, as if nothing had happened, continued to eat, not feeling any attention or looks, as if the world around him continued to spin, but he remained unperturbed, absorbed in his thoughts and food. Frozen with a fork and sausage at his mouth, he involuntarily slowed his chewing, thought, and, despite his carelessness, asked why everyone around him looked so dissatisfied, as if something important and heavy was hanging in the air, filling the atmosphere with tension. Disappointed glances, full of discontent and indignation, were directed in his direction, as if each of those present was trying to convey their feelings to him without saying a word, but only showing silent criticism. Calendia walked alone down the long corridor, her hair fluttering in the wind, and her step was determined, as if she was striving for some goal, not paying attention to the emptiness around her, only confidently moving forward, as if she knew her way. The noblewoman sat in the garden, surrounded by fragrant nature, where the air was filled with the scent of flowers, and an old bench served as a shelter for her thoughts, giving her the opportunity to immerse herself in thought without rushing and enjoying the silence. She stared blankly ahead, not noticing the beauty of the vegetation, her thoughts wandering, unable to focus on what was right in front of her, because everything seemed distant and alien at that moment, as if she was not here. She reminded herself that she had decided from the very beginning to obey the Duke in everything, and now she could not go against it, even if something deep down inside told her that her choice was wrong, and this path would not bring peace. Placing her hands on her chest, Calendia suddenly felt like she was in a cage again, just like in her previous home, where her freedom was limited and all her movements were controlled, as if she were once again a prisoner of her fate. Confused, the beauty grabbed her stomach sharply as it, from hunger, began to make sounds reminiscent of strange growls that seemed to become louder and louder, creating an uncomfortable silence in her mind. Suddenly she froze, hearing strange sounds from the side, and a thought flashed through her head. Could there really be some kind of animal hiding there that could be the cause of such a noise, attracting her attention at this moment? Calendia, as if alarmed by something important, jumped up from her seat and without thinking about anything else, hurried to go in search of the animal, full of determination to find out what was happening, not realizing that her actions might have been hasty. At this time in the dining room, people were discussing how upset Calendia looked when she left, and someone present noticed that her face clearly expressed displeasure, as if she was hiding her feelings. Together, they blamed Christo for everything, considering him cold and indifferent, especially towards his fiancée, whom he left alone at such a moment, without showing due attention to her experiences. The Duke listened to their words in silence, frowning, sitting on a chair at the table, having lost all appetite, as if heavy words surrounded him, absorbing all his strength and desire to continue the evening, leaving only anxiety. A barely noticeable drop of sweat rolled down his manly face, and the guy, realizing his mistake, quickly promised that he would definitely apologize to the lady, understanding the seriousness of the situation and its importance for future relationships. The prince, pointing his finger at his friend's back, firmly ordered him to apologize sincerely to the sweet lady, leaving him no choice, because he believed that such manners must be observed in order to maintain respect. Christo was dissatisfied and did not understand the reason for the noise of his friends, because they behaved with him like a child, as if his actions were under constant surveillance, and his decisions were not considered mature and reasonable. Quietly and hesitantly, Christo froze in front of the doors of his bride's chambers, not knowing how to start a conversation, feeling that each of his indecision only increased the distance between him and the girl, holding him back from decisive steps. Gathering all his will into a fist, he raised his hand and, not giving himself time to doubt, made several firm knocks on the door so as not to postpone the meeting, because each of his movements was a step forward, albeit with some anxiety. Receiving silence in response, Christo went inside, looking around, realizing that there was no one inside, and a strange feeling of anxiety arose in his chest, as if everything that was happening was part of some unsolved plan. Leaning on the windowsill, the man wondered where his bride had disappeared to, trying to understand what could have kept her in this empty room. But his thoughts were confused, and he could not find an answer, which only increased his anxiety. But suddenly, at the most unexpected moment, the Duke noticed her in the window. Calendia, fearless and determined, climbed the tree and without hesitation, crawled forward along the branch, as if forgetting about all the dangers and only moving forward, as if this was her natural state. Christo froze in surprise with his mouth open. His gaze remained frozen, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing, and anxiety appeared in his soul when he realized that her actions could be dangerous. Once on the branch, the little animal found itself in a confused situation where it did not know how to get down, and despite its agility, it could not find a safe path, which added tension to what was happening. The lady, without thinking, extended her hand forward, wanting to help the poor thing, deciding that at this moment her actions could be the only way to save her little friend from trouble, and her heart responded to this desire to help. But suddenly, she was distracted by the Duke, who was standing on the ground, and, with slight irritation in his voice, asked what this stupid girl was doing, committing such a rash act, not thinking about the consequences of her actions and risking her safety. At this point, the animal, as if frightened, jumped up, walking over Calendia's head, and, taking advantage of the moment, quickly ran away, leaving her completely confused and feeling that everything happened too quickly. Calendia herself, unable to contain her shock, began to fall down, weakening her grip and losing her balance. Her body seemed to no longer obey her great will, and everything that was happening seemed surreal to her. Below, she was carefully caught by male hands, which seemed to immediately come to her aid, preventing her from falling, and such a fall was slowed down, but not stopped completely, until she found herself in safe hands. Christo held the lady tightly, asking carefully if she was okay, worried about her condition, and that look was full of anxiety as he could not afford to lose her, not knowing what could happen if he did not make it in time. Pressing her hands awkwardly to her chest, the maiden thanked her savior, barely holding back her emotions, and the woman's voice was full of gratitude despite the fact that she felt awkward and confused in such a situation. Some time passed, but the man still did not let her go to the ground, continuing to hold her, and Calendia, feeling slightly uneasy and awkward, quietly asked him to let her go, unable to remain in such an embrace for long. The little animal, hiding behind a tree, continued to watch what was happening, its small eyes following every movement of the couple, as if it were an invisible witness to the strange scene that was unfolding before it. The young couple stood silently, the wind playing with their hair, their shadows stretching across the ground, reflecting their thoughtful silence and the feeling that time had slowed down, allowing them to think about what was happening around them. The Duke thought to himself that he should have apologized to his bride for the harsh words he had spoken earlier, because now he realized how much they could have hurt her, and regret weighed on his soul. At the same time, Calendia, lost in her thoughts, reproached herself for her clumsiness, realizing that her actions were not always thoughtful, and at that moment she wanted only one thing: to eat to satisfy her growing hunger. Fearing that her stomach would start making sounds again, the lady firmly decided that she would go to the table right now, without putting it off for a long time, and without even thinking about how this might affect her further actions. With a polite bow of her head, she bowed before her future husband and thanked him for his help, expressing her gratitude, while wanting to leave this place as quickly as possible so as not to prolong the awkward pause. However, the Duke was not going to let her go so easily, asking her to stop and not leave. His voice was full of insistence, and he did not want everything to end on such a note, as he felt that he had something important to say. Christo tried to look up. His heart was beating faster with anxiety, and he was scared, unable to find the right words to apologize, as each word was difficult for him, and he was afraid that everything could be lost. Finally, making up his mind, he raised his head, his eyes meeting hers, and gathering all his resolve, he uttered an apology in one sincere word, his voice firm and full of regret, as if he was giving away a part of his soul at that moment. The young couple stood frozen, facing each other, both waiting for the other's reaction. Their eyes met, and in the silence, only the light breathing could be heard, which seemed so loud at that moment. The noblewoman never understood why he asked for forgiveness, and did not attach much importance to it. Her thoughts were occupied with something else, and she perceived what had happened as something fleeting and not so important to her. She eventually decided that his reaction was related to her falling from the tree, and with a slight sigh, she added that he had done nothing wrong, because it had all happened by accident, and his actions were correct in that situation. Calendia closed her eyes and calmly said that he had done the right thing, and that no apology was needed, because in her eyes, there was nothing to apologize for, as everything had been done with the best intentions. After that, she left, leaving the Duke alone, and, quietly walking along the corridor, she felt how the tension gradually left her, but a slight trace of what had happened remained in her soul. The Duke, however, understood her reaction in his own way, and, remaining in thought, assumed that the lady was furious at his behavior, thinking that she might be irritated by his behavior, although in fact her feelings were quite different. The noblewoman was genuinely glad that her stomach had not made a single sound, avoiding embarrassment and feeling relieved that her worries had not caused further inconvenience in this awkward moment. The Duke watched quietly from the doorway as the interaction between his old friend and his fiancée took place, feeling the tension in his soul not let up as he watched their conversation continue in a relaxed manner. Calendia laughed as she chatted with Riley in the kitchen, her laughter sounding easy and natural, creating an atmosphere of comfort in which even heavy thoughts were left far behind, and her mood was almost serene. The day after the argument, he watched her for a long time as she tended to the flowers in the garden. Her movements were confident and graceful, and he felt a certain silence that was hard to ignore. Realizing that their relationship had changed, after the meal, the silence continued. The sounds of the dinner were muffled, and there was a slight awkwardness in the air that was difficult to dispel, despite the efforts of everyone present to remain calm. The girl felt the changes only after 3 days, when, in addition to taking care of the court, she noticed that the Duke and she had stopped communicating, which awakened in her soul a feeling of insecurity and slight anxiety about their relationship. When she turned to speak to him, Christo immediately hid behind a tree. His fear of her possible anger was visible to the naked eye, and he, like a child, tried to avoid her gaze, not knowing what to say or how to justify himself. The man lowered his head, as if under the weight of his thoughts, and thought that it was Kalendia who was avoiding him, not wanting to meet and see him, leaving him alone with a growing sense of guilt and anxiety. Without thinking twice, he decided that he had to fix the situation, and, plucking up his courage, he walked towards her, loudly declaring that he would help her with the cleaning, hoping that his offer would create at least a small spark of trust between them. However, the Duke remained with his hand outstretched when the lady, hearing his words, moved away in fear, as if not understanding how to react to his unexpected gesture, and anxiety flashed in her eyes. The beauty, as if making excuses, quickly stated that she was in a hurry, and without giving him time to say more, ran away, leaving him with a feeling of confusion and bewilderment from her reaction. She walked quickly away, but suddenly remembered that she had left her laundry outside, and with alarm realized that if it started to rain, it would get wet, which made her quicken her steps, hoping to get back in time. The wind rustled softly outside the window, the rain drummed on the glass, and the room was silent, broken only by the sounds of nature. The rose on the windowsill seemed especially bright against the cloudy sky, filling the space with soft light. Covered with a warm blanket, the man lay on the bed, his gaze fixed on one point, and it seemed that he was absorbed in his thoughts, trying to find answers to the questions that did not leave him. The men standing behind the door, assessing the situation, came to the conclusion that the man was probably very upset and sad, since his behavior and silence clearly indicated internal conflict and experiences. Ferdinand, winking with enthusiasm, asked with a slight smile if it was time to intervene and offer his help, trying to make the atmosphere less tense and more lively. Under the sheet lay Christo, sadly thinking about how he could have offended his fiancée so much, consumed by the thought that his actions could have been perceived differently than he wanted. And now he did not know how to correct the situation. The Duke, completely bewildered and confused, was at a loss, because in his long life of more than 50 years, he had never found himself in such a situation, and his self-confidence was undermined. Suddenly, the man's peace was interrupted by the heir to the throne calling him loudly, and this sharp sound broke the silence, forcing him to quickly come to his senses and realize that the situation required immediate attention. Christo froze in place as he saw people standing next to the fallen butler, who seemed to feign fatigue as he lay on the floor. But his behavior clearly made the Duke suspicious of the reality of what was happening. Frowning, the prince explained that Riley had injured his lower back while cleaning the windows, but his explanation didn't sound entirely convincing, and it only fueled the questions in Christo's mind about what had really happened. The Duke, looking intently at his old friend, gave him a glance as if checking the truth of his words and trying to understand whether there was some deception hidden behind them, which put him into a state of alertness. The girl, having played her part, quietly said that she would go for medicine, but since she did not know the area, she could use some help. And this suggestion, like a casual remark, caused a certain alarm in everyone. Ferdinand, shrugging his shoulders, said that he himself did not know the area well, but nevertheless offered Christo to help the lady, silently hinting at the need for intervention, since the situation was becoming more and more alarming and unclear. Christo frowned and realized that the prince was talking about the very city that was located at the foot of the mountain, and the memories of it returned to him with an unpleasant sharpness, because this city was not alien to him. The heir to the throne, not wanting to give in and let the noblewoman go alone for medicine, was ready to persuade the Duke to help, not wanting the situation to become more complicated since it seemed too important for further delay. With his hands folded in front of him, the boy, as if in a serious manner beyond his years, asked the Duke for help, demonstrating his determination and naive confidence that with his participation, everything could be resolved quickly and correctly. Having received the Duke's consent, the prince and Riley watched as the young couple left the courtyard, while the beast slowly wandered down the street, reflecting the harmony of nature, which seemed so far from what was happening at that moment. The nobles, with a feeling of solemnity and confidence, mounted their magnificent black horses and, slightly adjusting their stirrups, began their journey, confidently moving forward, against the backdrop of the horizon, already colored by the evening light. Ferdinand, watching their departure with a benevolent smile, warmly wished them a happy and safe journey, with the hope that everything would go well as they rode away into the distance, leaving only a dusty trail behind them. The horse galloped powerfully and quickly along the road, his hooves echoing with a loud clatter on the hard ground, creating a sense of rapid movement, while the wind fluttered his mane, carrying away the scent of freedom and wind. The aristocrat, absorbed in her thoughts, reflected on how fortunate it was that Christo, a man with whom she had crossed paths more than once in life, agreed to accompany her on this journey. Suddenly, at the most unexpected moment, Christo, looking at his bride with a mysterious look, wondered whether the presence of this woman was unnatural, and whether it contradicted his own feelings and thoughts that began to arise. The noblewoman was genuinely surprised to hear that the man had thought all this time that she was angry with him, although in fact, her feelings were completely different, and her reaction to his actions was far from what he imagined. The nobleman reminded her of a recent conversation when, in his opinion, she had taken offense at him because of the rude and perhaps harsh words he had spoken at that moment, which had caused misunderstanding and confusion in their relationship. Pressing her hand to her chest and feeling how hard it was for her to reveal the truth, the aristocrat firmly insisted that she herself was to blame for her fall from the tree, when, without thinking, she rushed and almost broke her leg, for which she later felt ashamed. The horse, watching what was happening and the tame nature of the Duke, finally explained that he actually thought she was angry with him, not because of his words, but because he refused to invite her to the upcoming celebration, which she found offensive. Calendia, with a serious expression, resolutely objected and explained that she had left the company so hastily not because of disagreements, but because she was simply very hungry at that moment, and so decided to leave quickly to eat and rest. While the lady was embarrassed, the guy suddenly, as if not realizing the boundaries of decency, leaned against her shoulder, bowing his head and pressing his face, which caused her even more embarrassment and surprise at his boldness. The beauty, feeling growing bewilderment, asked with surprise and slight excitement what he was doing and if everything was okay with him, trying to understand his strange behavior and decide how to react to such unexpected closeness. The nobleman, having relaxed a little and feeling the tension leave, said with relief that he was sincerely glad that she was not angry, and that his words and actions had finally found a response that calmed his heart. He controlled the horse with confidence, feeling how his hands easily held the reins, and internally he felt much better, knowing that his fears were in vain, and she did not hold a grudge against him, as he feared. The horse's hooves, striking the ground hard, made a loud and sharp clatter that echoed along the road, emphasizing their rapid forward movement, as well as the fleeting thoughts of each of them, filling the air with sounds and an atmosphere of freedom. Soon, making their way through the thick trees that hid the road, the outlines of the city gradually began to appear from behind their branches and leaves, its buildings becoming increasingly clear against the backdrop of the cloudy sky. The great mansion stood in the darkness, cold and lifeless, as if abandoned by all its inhabitants, its windows radiating neither light nor warmth, and its very massive structure seemed muted in the evening shadows. The head of the house, clutching his head in despair, said in confusion that the Duke's money had run out, and now they found themselves in a very difficult position, facing the consequences of a financial collapse that seemed impossible. Mother, not understanding how this could happen, asked in surprise how this was possible, because there was so much money, and they could not imagine that they would ever find themselves on the brink of poverty despite all their wealth. With a wave of his hand and a gesture full of displeasure and fatigue, The man ordered his wife to shut her mouth immediately, not allowing her to ask any more questions, which, in his opinion, only worsened their already difficult situation. He blamed his wife and daughter for everything, accusing them of mindlessly spending money on expensive, useless dresses and jewelry, without thinking about how important it was to spend money wisely during this difficult period. The noblewoman, unable to bear the accusations, with a decisive and stern voice, ordered her husband to be silent and stop blaming them, assuring him that there was no fault in their actions, and the problems were much deeper than he imagined. Behind the door, quietly eavesdropping on her parents' conversation, stood Isabella in her new dress that she had just received, and, hiding her sadness, she felt her heart squeeze from the fact that the atmosphere in the family had become so tense. She was very sad that her mother and father quarreled so often. Their dissatisfaction with each other became more and more obvious, and this destroyed the harmony that she once considered unshakable in their home. Gritting her teeth, Isabella couldn't shake off the memory of Calendia, leaving behind a void. But despite that, the quarrels and disagreements in the family continued, as if nothing could bring back the former peace and quiet. Bright violet eyes, like two bright lights, looked into the distance, and the lady could not remember why everything around her had become so gloomy and disturbing, as if she had lost touch with the past, and nothing brought the same joy. In a rude, irritated tone, the noblewoman addressed the frightened maid who was carrying the sheets, demanding that she immediately do everything as it should be done, without allowing herself any mistakes or delays, despite the woman's visible fear. Isabella, with a firm and decisive voice, ordered the carriage to be brought, for she was going to go into town to do some shopping, deciding that she needed a little distraction from her domestic cares and to find solace in her acquisitions. The city was made of ancient stones, its streets were full of stories, and the openings between the buildings resembled gates to another forgotten world, where time seemed to have stopped, and every corner hides something mysterious and majestic. Calendia, taking a deep breath, said that they had gotten there very quickly, although in fact her look betrayed her fatigue, and she felt that the road, although short, had taken a lot of her strength. Christo, carefully looking after the horse, taking the ropes in his hands and directing it in the right direction, showed all his care and attention to the animal, as if it were an important part of their path, like a faithful companion on this journey. Raising his head up, the man, with a slight note of satisfaction in his voice, suddenly said that they had finally arrived where they were going, as if the very moment of reaching the goal was no less important to him than the entire path traveled before. Politely and respectfully, he offered his hand to the lady, wanting to help her get down from the carriage, which was a manifestation of gallantry and good manners, because he knew how important such gestures are in a society where every movement emphasizes status. Holding hands and closely watching her movements, Christo asked with slight bewilderment if the beauty didn't need help, because, despite her confidence, he still saw slight anxiety and indecision in her gaze. Slowly and carefully, the woman's hand touched the man's, as if seeking support to lean on him, feeling how his strength and confidence gave her peace in this moment when everything seemed new and unfamiliar. She was treated badly in the Count's house, often feeling the weight of his anger, and once when she tried to escape, his rough hands grabbed her by the hair, causing pain and making her feel like there was no corner where she could be safe. Moreover, she was often beaten and locked in a cold, empty closet where even light could not penetrate. And this place, filled with fear and loneliness, became for her a symbol of torment and hopelessness. And now, at this moment, the touch did not bring pain as before, but, on the contrary, brought tenderness and affection, filling the heart with warmth and a sense of security that she had been deprived of for so long. The girl accepted the help with a smile, enjoying the touch of hands, which became for her a symbol of care and understanding, as if for the first time in her life she felt that there was someone who was ready to support her. A memory flashed through the maiden's mind of how the Duke always tried to help her, fulfilling all her requests, while she felt like a stranger in her home, surrounded only by coldness and indifference. While the foster family humiliated and beat her, he, on the contrary, showed kindness and care, as if he knew how important support was for her during this difficult period of her life, when everything around her seemed hostile. Suddenly, the beauty froze, as if remembering something, and her gaze dimmed, and her thoughts slid towards the indelible pain and fear that she had experienced in the past, which surfaced in her memory as an unbearable burden. She pressed her hands to her chest as if she could feel the pain coming over her again, although in reality it was only the memory of past suffering that seemed still alive, as if it were happening right now. She felt sad that the Duke, despite all his care, seemed to be trying to hide her from the whole world, shielding her from reality and creating the illusion of security, which perhaps only increased her loneliness. Noticing that his companion had stopped, the aristocrat also froze, his gaze full of concern, and he, without hiding his surprise, asked what had happened to her, because he felt that something had changed in her behavior, but did not know how exactly to explain it. Looking down and trying to hide her true feelings, the lady lied that everything was fine, although the blue of her eyes, full of sadness and sorrow, betrayed her true state, contradicting what she was trying to show outwardly. As she followed her fiancé, she reminded herself that they were bound only by the marriage contract and nothing more. And despite all his efforts, she felt that her heart remained alien to him, as if there was no real connection between them. The city they were walking through was so big and confusing that it was easy to get lost among its narrow streets and tall buildings. Every corner seemed like a new world, hiding many secrets and surprises. The noblewoman could not contain her delight as she admired the local color and the bustling market, where the smells of fresh spices and the sounds of trade created an atmosphere full of life, as if the land itself radiated energy and joy. But then, suddenly interrupting her admiration, the aristocrat sharply ordered her not to behave so suspiciously, as if his senses had become heightened, and he felt a threat, although the situation itself remained quite peaceful and harmless. He himself, hiding his face under a hood, attracted much more attention in broad daylight than his companion, because his efforts to remain unnoticed only increased the interest of those around him, creating a feeling of mystery and anxiety. Suddenly, the wind blew and their robes fluttered in the wind, as if they themselves had become part of this great city, adding another element to the picture, where everything was permeated with movement, change, and a sense of incompleteness. In his heart, the Duke wished that this day would end as soon as possible, so that he could leave the city and return home, where he was surrounded by familiar walls, and where he could again feel the peace and tranquility that was missing in this bustling place. In the middle of the street, towering over the other buildings, stood a golden statue of the hero, symbolizing the greatness and strength of this man who once saved the city from certain death, leaving a mark on the hearts of all residents. Calendia, leaving her companion behind, hurried forward to examine more closely the golden stone, which was so shining in the sun, and she felt her breath taken away by its grandeur and beauty. She stopped at the foot of the Duke's statue, looking in delight at every detail and admiring the skill with which this monument was created, which seemed alive and full of strength, as if the hero himself was right in front of her. On the base of the statue was an inscription that 50 years ago this hero saved the city, leaving his mark in history, and all the residents remembered his feat as something great and unforgettable. The Duke himself, however, did not share the admiration for the beauty of the monument, standing to the side, as if embarrassed by his own greatness, and his gaze was full of anxiety, because he did not want to be the center of attention, even when people admired his feat. Suddenly, a strong wind blew, and the hood fell from the man's face. His features became visible to passers-by, and the leaves around him began to swirl in the air, giving the whole event an atmosphere of surprise and excitement. Concerned, the aristocrat immediately turned to his companion, anxiously asking if she was hurt somewhere, because his attention at that moment was focused not only on external events, but also on the safety of the one who was next to him. Suddenly, among the crowd, several passing men, noticing the resemblance, began to compare the Duke with the golden statue, noting that this guy strongly resembled the very hero to whose figure the monument was erected. Instantly, the nobleman pulled his hood over himself, trying to hide his face, not wanting to be recognized and attract attention. He preferred to remain in the shadows, avoiding conversations and looks that could reveal his identity. He silently listened to the conversations of passers-by, not showing any emotions, as if hiding his anxiety, only clutching the fabric of his hood tighter, but not reacting to their words in any way, trying to remain unnoticed among the crowd. Christo, his eyes wide open, peered into the dark space where words were heard that penetrated his soul like icy needles. calling him a monster, a creature that lives forever, devoid of any humanity. His hand clenched into a fist, and, holding back the inner anger that flared up with every word he spoke, he felt how fear mixed with rage seized his heart, but he did not allow himself to show weakness. With a feeling of deep frustration, looking down at the floor, he mentally convinced himself that such an outcome was inevitable, because those around him were always right in their words. He really was a monster. However, unexpectedly, Calendia, noticing what was happening, decisively intervened in the dispute between strangers, demanding that they immediately apologize to Christo for their disrespectful and offensive words. The young men, visibly frowning and looking at each other in bewilderment, turned to her with a challenge, asking what exactly she meant by demanding an explanation in such a categorical form. The man, indignantly pointing his finger in the direction of the lady, said with irritation that she was behaving like a rude and boorish woman, clearly trying to humiliate her in front of those present. Calendia, without thinking, decided to intervene in what was happening, realizing how difficult it is for a person deprived of the opportunity to defend himself, to resist rudeness and injustice that break the spirit and dignity. Her eyes sparkled with righteous anger and an unwavering desire to defend the good name of her fiancé, reflecting all the determination not to allow the humiliation of the one who was dear to her. With determination in her voice, she firmly and without a shadow of a doubt declared that the Duke, despite evil words and gossip, was not a monster, but was an example of true nobility and generosity. Curious townspeople, hearing a loud voice coming from the middle of a noisy street, began to stop their steps, turning around to understand the reason for the escalating conflict and assess its significance. Christo noted with obvious irritation that their loud squabble was beginning to attract unnecessary attention from passers-by, and he realized that such publicity would only complicate their already tense situation. He calmly but firmly placed his hand on his companion's shoulder, as if trying to restore her composure, and in a restrained voice ordered her to be silent, demanding that they continue on their way without delay, without attracting further attention. However, the noblewoman, despite his attempts to stop her, did not want to accept the injustice, and, raising her voice, cried out in despair how it could happen that no one present felt sorry for the unfortunate Duke, suffering from slander. Addressing the boys with obvious reproach in her voice, she firmly stated that the aristocrat about whom they spoke so rudely had experienced deep suffering for a long time, and, instead of ridicule, deserved sympathy and human understanding. Filled with rage, her face flushed with indignation, Calendia solemnly promised that she could never forgive those present for their heartless and cruel behavior, which she considered unworthy of a true man. Suddenly, several guards appeared from the square, hurrying towards them with loud shouts that a group of violators had caused chaos and disorder, requiring immediate intervention. Realizing the seriousness of the situation, Christo instantly grabbed his companion by the hand, decisively indicating to her that it was time to leave this place immediately before they could be captured. Taking her hand, he quickly led his companion along, trying to calm her indignation, while she continued to loudly demand an apology from the guys, who stood there in bewilderment. The guards, looking at each other in confusion, combed the streets and alleys of the city, hoping to find the troublemakers who had cleverly fled the scene, avoiding punishment. Having managed to turn into the nearest narrow alley, Christo quickly pressed himself against the wall and carefully placed his hand on his companion's lips, begging her without words to remain silent so as not to give away their refuge. Freed from her companion's grip, she, barely containing her anger, quietly but decisively whispered that she would certainly make those rude people apologize to the Duke for their insolent and offensive words. Hearing her determined tone and furious promise, Christo couldn't help but let out a hearty laugh, which came unexpectedly loudly, as if releasing the tension of the situation. In her mind, Calendia noted with obvious disdain that those impudent guys probably had no idea in whose honor the majestic golden statue that adorned the city's central street was erected. Having collected her thoughts and feeling guilty for what had happened, the noblewoman turned to her companion in an apologetic tone, asking for forgiveness for the fact that her careless behavior had drawn undue attention to them. Christo, standing nearby, smiled widely with visible pleasure, radiating joy and satisfaction at how absurdly and even funny this situation was unfolding, despite its tension. Looking closely into her eyes, Filled with anxiety, he carefully placed his hand on the girl's head, trying not only to support her in this difficult moment, but also to instill a sense of peace and confidence. With genuine warmth and noticeable joy in his voice, Christo admitted that the noble lady's words touched him to the depths of his soul, and with a slight smile, added that hunger had made itself felt more strongly than expected. Her cheeks flushed softly as her gaze fell on his confident figure, gradually disappearing into the distance. Calendia's thoughts remained tied to the one who had just stepped forward with ease, leaving her lost in thought. The Duke, looking at his companion with slight curiosity, suddenly asked a question, sounding with friendly warmth. What kind of food could give her special pleasure and lift her spirits at this moment? Alarmed by his unexpected question, the girl was momentarily confused, blushed slightly, and unable to find the words, decided with touching hesitation to leave the choice of the dish to the discretion of her future husband. The two of them slowly moved further along the road, enjoying the quiet atmosphere around them, and making a mutual decision to make a short stop at a cozy cafe that was located very close by. Lurking around the corner, they carefully watched every movement of the guards, trying to catch the right moment to slip past unnoticed and avoid an unwanted confrontation. Looking around carefully, Christo could not help but notice how an almost frightening silence reigned on this section of the road, which was only occasionally broken by the light rustling of leaves in a weak wind. Calendia walked confidently behind Christo, trying to stay close and not lag behind even a step, as if she was afraid of getting lost or leaving him alone on this path. Sitting at a small table in a cozy corner of the cafe, they slowly savored aromatic drinks and delicious dishes, enjoying the long-awaited break in their journey. With a sincere smile, Christo offered Calendia to try the fresh pastries, which were impossible to refuse, and she, without hiding her pleasure, ate them almost immediately, admiring the delicate taste. After a long journey, they finally stopped at an old building with a peeling sign that once proudly announced that it housed the only pharmacy in the area. With genuine joy on her face, Calendia clutched a small paper bag of medicine tightly to her chest, while saying that they now had the opportunity to alleviate Riley's condition and perhaps cure him completely. Her gaze involuntarily stopped on an exquisite white dress, which was displayed with particular elegance in the window of a nearby store, as if inviting every passing girl to look inside. This fashion store, with its luxurious windows and stylish outfits, has long been considered Isabella's favorite place, where she always chose the most elegant dresses for special occasions. The skillfully crafted dress, decorated with delicate ribbons the color of pure snow, exquisite floral patterns, and sophisticated lace, seemed to attract the eye and envelop the wearer in the magic of its unique beauty. Taking a few steps forward, Christo suddenly froze, catching how his companion was looking with special interest and hidden admiration at the outfit displayed in the window. With a gentle smile, trying not to embarrass the girl, Christo carefully asked if she would like to try on or buy this exquisite dress that seemed to attract her so much. The girl, blushing slightly, lowered her gaze, and with slight hesitation, admitted that she had never had an occasion that would allow her to appear in such a magnificent dress. At that moment, images suddenly appeared in Christo's mind, where his brave and determined bride, forgetting about her own fears, stood up for his defense with such selflessness that her act remained unforgettable for him. So, after thinking deeply and digesting all the events, he decided to change his initial opinion, quietly saying that he probably shouldn't have worried so much before, giving in to emotions that seemed important to him at that moment. The beauty, as if struck by his words, froze in complete stillness, staring at him, unable to immediately understand what exactly Christo wanted to say, trying to comprehend his suddenly changed behavior. The man, taking a deep breath, decided that from now on he would always be by her side, providing her with his support, confidence, and help in any situation, ready to be her support and reliable protector in any life situation. The man's hand, tenderly and caringly, wrapped itself around the woman's, as if trying to convey all of his warmth and protection. This simple but expressive gesture contained all of the strength of his feelings, his readiness to support and be there at any moment. Kneeling before his bride, Christo, with a heartfelt expression on his face, tenderly asked her to accompany him to the special occasion, which was not just an invitation, but a manifestation of respect and deep affection. Calendia, puzzled and not understanding what exactly he meant, asked again in bewilderment, because just recently he himself claimed that he wanted to go to the event alone, without anyone's accompaniment. Christo, smiling softly, explained that he had changed his mind, and now, realizing how important her support was, he wanted to have her next to him, because his thoughts and feelings had changed, and he could not imagine this moment without her. Still kneeling, he again expressed his request, inviting the lady to the ball. His voice sounded sincere, and his gaze was full of hope and tenderness, because this was an important and significant event for him, in which she was supposed to be. The noblewoman, after some hesitation, finally accepted his invitation, adding that if he himself did not object to her coming, she would be glad to be there, but still she wanted to be sure that her participation would not cause inconvenience. Suddenly, unexpectedly for Christo, the lady, a little embarrassed, said that she did not have a suitable dress for such a formal event, which made her feel out of place in light of the upcoming importance of the event. Christo, without losing confidence, pointed with his hand to the display case where a white dress was hanging on a mannequin, and confidently said that this particular outfit, in his opinion, would look perfect on her, just right for her refined taste. Raising her hands in front of her, as if trying to refuse, the aristocrat began to protest, explaining that the outfit was too expensive and she could not afford such luxury, because she did not want to be a burden to Christo or expose herself in overly expensive things. Without thinking twice, the man, deciding not to back down from his idea, carefully grabbed his companion by the hand and, with ease and care, carried her to the store, confidently saying that he was quite capable of providing her with everything she needed without experiencing any difficulties. At that moment, a sound signal rang through the air as the bell at the door of the store rang, signaling that new customers had entered the store, attracting the attention of all the staff and creating a sense of excitement in the room. Inside the store, there was a woman who greeted the guests with a polite smile and was ready to provide them with assistance without the slightest hesitation, showing a high level of service, which made the atmosphere even more welcoming and hospitable. Calendia, covering her mouth with her hands, could not hide her admiration, surprised by how beautiful and luxurious it was inside, as if she had entered another world where every element was thought out to the smallest detail, creating an atmosphere of refined elegance. The woman, noticing the customers in strange clothes, approached them with a polite smile and asked what exactly they wanted to buy from the outfits, ready to offer them the best choice in accordance with their tastes and preferences. Christo, without thinking, easily threw a bag of money into the lady's hands, confidently declaring that they would like to buy a white dress from the display case, and, not paying attention to those around them, expected that their wish would be fulfilled without delay. In complete shock, the woman stared at the amount of money that was in the bag, unable to immediately comprehend how much the client was willing to spend. But while she was still in amazement, the Duke added that she should also pick out shoes and accessories that would perfectly complement the outfit. Immediately, as soon as the woman came to her senses, she bowed politely, expressing gratitude for such a generous offer, and loudly promised that she would fulfill the client's request with the utmost diligence and attention, so that everything would be done at the highest level. Christo, not wanting to embarrass the bride with his presence, went outside to wait for her, giving her some time to calmly choose and try on an outfit without feeling any unnecessary pressure. The city had changed a lot in recent years. New houses, remodeled streets, and modernized buildings created a completely different appearance that was not immediately recognizable, and everything now seemed new and unfamiliar. The nobleman, looking around, turned his gaze to a clothing store that had not been in this place before, surprised at how quickly everything was changing, and noticing that the city continued to develop and transform. Suddenly, when the man began to retreat back, he unexpectedly collided with another person, who, without having time to react, fell to the ground, which was a complete surprise for both. It was Isabella in an elegant purple dress, who, unable to restrain herself, began to loudly curse at the rude man who was not looking where he was going, and now, in her opinion, violated her personal space, provoking anger. Christo, with an expression of sincere regret on his face, asked for forgiveness, and, holding out his hand, offered the lady his help so that she could stand up, doing everything so that her embarrassment was minimal, and she did not feel uncomfortable. Like a true gentleman, he carefully inquired if the beauty was hurt, showing concern and attention to make sure that she was okay and had not suffered from the unexpected collision. Isabella, blushing with embarrassment, felt her cheeks turn bright red, and the look she directed in his direction was full of a hidden feeling of love that she tried to hide. But it was obvious. Christo, despite his simple black robe, looked noble and aristocratic. His posture, manners, and self-confidence emphasized his high origin, despite the lack of excessive luxury in his clothing. The woman's hand, without thinking, reached forward to the man's, wanting to touch and feel his support. There was something tender and trusting in this gesture, as if she hoped that he would help her in any situation. But suddenly, unexpectedly, a saleswoman came out of the store and announced that the order was ready, and Christo, with instant determination, pulled his hand away and without saying a word, turned sharply towards the store, leaving Isabella perplexed. Isabella was left alone, sitting on the ground, with an expression of indignation and pride on her face, reaching out to the departing guy, feeling offended and humiliated, not understanding why he left so suddenly without finishing their conversation. At that moment, a maid with bags and purchases hurried to the aristocrat, shouting her name, but her words and haste could not bring back the attention of the noblewoman, who was absorbed in her thoughts and worries about the recent incident. The noblewoman, unable to bear the servant's interference, angrily shouted at the maid, who always irritated her, trying to drive her away with her rage and not wanting to show the slightest gratitude for the help, feeling that her pride had been hurt. Turning her gaze to the closed door of the store, Isabella muttered to herself that she had finally met her chosen one, her future husband, deep down already painting pictures of their future together. Suddenly, surprised, she froze, hearing the words that if she behaved badly, her father would not take her with him to the birthday party and the ball, which caused her unexpected anxiety and doubt about her behavior. Smiling resolutely, Isabella decided that this meeting with the handsome man was far from the last, and she should watch her behavior so as not to let her father down and not lose such an important event. Together with the servants, a little confused by her thoughts, but full of determination, the beauty went away, leaving behind all her worries and deciding how to act next time so as not to miss the chance. Isabella thought to herself that she would eagerly await the next meeting with her new lover, anticipating how this relationship would develop and how it would become an integral part of her life and destiny. Christo obediently followed the saleswoman up the stairs, taking his time and listening to every word, feeling how his attention was focused on her and on what was about to happen in the coming moments. The lady opened the door for the young gentleman, inviting him to enter with a slight bow of her head and a graceful gesture, as if emphasizing the importance of his visit and the desire to treat him to everything that might please him. There, inside, Calendia was waiting for him, dressed in a new white dress that so skillfully revealed her fragile legs, emphasizing her slender figure, and the white fabric flowed softly, creating an effect of weightlessness and lightness. The lady, a little embarrassed, carefully asked the guy what he thought of her new look, feeling her heart flutter, because his opinion was important to her, and she hoped that he would appreciate her efforts. The Duke, without a word, approached the beauty, his gaze full of determination and strength, which made her feel a slight excitement that she could hardly hide. Remaining in his presence, waiting for the next step, sweat began to pour down the boy's face, and his mouth fell open as he felt the tension inside him, unable to hide his feelings that began to spill out despite his attempts to remain calm. Turning away from the noblewoman, he modestly replied that she looked fine, trying to hide his true emotions so as not to give himself away. But there was still some hidden anxiety and worry in his voice. The saleswoman offered to carefully pack the dress for the young lady, and she, reservedly and politely, thanked the woman. I felt her heart fill with gratitude for the attention and care shown to her. Christo, still standing with his back to the beauty, said that it was time for them to return home. His words were full of determination, and although he did not turn around, his gaze was directed forward, waiting for her to follow him. Placing her hands on her chest, Calendia nodded and agreed to follow the already departing Duke, feeling her steps become lighter and her heart fill with anticipation of the next stage in their mutual relationship. When the door closed, Christo was unable to stay on his feet and, succumbing to the weight of his emotions, fell to the floor, feeling his body weaken from the excitement he had experienced. and the lack of understanding of what had just happened. Calendia looked so beautiful in her new dress that it simply took his breath away. Her appearance was so dazzling that every movement seemed to be the embodiment of elegance and sophistication, leaving him no chance for restraint. The Duke's cheeks were covered with a slight blush, and his look, full of excitement, betrayed his entire internal struggle, in which there was no room for calm. He felt how his feelings covered him with his head, causing a storm of emotions. He grabbed her neck with his hand, asking her why he had come across such a beauty, feeling how this moment was becoming the most important in his life, because he could not even imagine that he would find himself in such a state, having fallen under her magic. Several days passed, and night fell upon the mansion. Hiding in the dark corners of its walls, the shadows of thoughts that hovered in the air, until the silence of the night was filled with a quiet expectation of what was to happen in the next moments. The cup of tea was filled to the brim, and its aroma emanating from the saucer filled the air with warmth and comfort, creating an atmosphere of calm and tranquility in which every word sounded soft and unhurried. The prince sat next to the Duke, and opposite them, like the embodiment of grace and beauty, sat Calendia, and they were all talking, immersed in a conversation that seemed to overshadow everything else at that moment. Looking down sheepishly, Calendia began to explain that although they had gone to get medicine for Riley, they had returned with a new dress for her, holding back a smile and feeling her words falter slightly with awkwardness. The heir to the throne laughed, saying that there was no need to worry so much, that their trip was full of unexpected turns, and his laughter filled the room, revealing an atmosphere of lightness and carelessness. Christo, sitting on the couch, suddenly announced that he had decided to go to the ball with his bride, essentially turning all their plans upside down and becoming the first to decide on such a step that could change their future. The prince stood frozen in place with the cookie in his hands, his face smeared with crumbs, his surprise so obvious that it seemed he couldn't believe what he was hearing. But his involuntary laughter soon sounded in response to what was happening. Suddenly, Ferdinand pressed himself closer to the Duke and began to ask him to stay with them longer, his voice sounding pleading, as if this moment was the most important thing for him, and he could not afford to miss such an opportunity. Calendia covered her mouth with her hand, barely holding back her laughter and smile. Her face lit up with a playful expression as she watched what was happening, but she tried to remain serious, understanding the awkwardness of the situation. At that moment, the butler burst into the room, calling loudly for his master. His steps were quick and decisive, and this sudden intervention attracted everyone's attention, breaking the atmosphere of ease and trust that reigned in the room. The man approached the lord and quietly informed him that a letter had arrived for him. His words were short but important, as the letter could be the key to new information that could possibly change the course of events. The paper was passed from one hand to the other, under the steadfast gaze of the lady, whose attention was entirely fixed upon the document, as if their fate or the decision she was about to make depended upon it. It turned out that this was a message from the family of the Count and also former relatives of the Duke's bride. And in this letter, there were secrets or requests that they had to consider with due attention and caution. Calendia stood frozen in shock, fearing her family's reaction, her heart beating anxiously, and every sound seemed loud, while her face was frozen in a mixture of fear and bewilderment at the unexpected consequences. In her hand, she held a wooden lantern, behind the glass of which a candle burned, illuminating the surrounding space with a dim light, creating shadows that at this hour of the night seemed especially bright and ominous. The noblewoman went out late at night to eavesdrop on someone else's conversation. Her steps were careful and quiet, so as not to attract attention, and curiosity pulled her forward despite the danger of being caught. She stood quietly next to the door, making no noise, like a shadow, merging with the darkness, and tried to catch every word that could shed light on the truths hidden from her. Riley asked the gentleman what he thought about the letter that had arrived. His voice was calm, but there was a note of concern in it, because further steps and decisions depended on this letter. Reading the letter, Christo briefly replied that, apparently, the Count and his relatives had quickly squandered their funds and were now again demanding money from him. His voice was even, but there was a shadow of disappointment in it from the constant requests. The butler screamed in shock. How could these people spend the money so quickly when it would have lasted for 3 years? His voice trembled with surprise and indignation, He could not believe such wasteful behavior. The gloved hand lay on the document, despite the fact that the aristocrat had taken their unloved wife. But it seemed that the money he brought in was insufficient, and all this was not enough to satisfy their needs. The look with red eyes burned with hatred and anger. It contained all the weight of disappointment, and the desire to punish those who caused pain could not help but be reflected in his face. Christo was angry because he couldn't help but notice how thin the young lady who was sent to him as a wife was. His heart sank with pity and anger. He couldn't understand how anyone could allow such a thing to happen to their child. And the prince had previously said that Calendia never came to balls. And, drawing a conclusion, Christo realized that the beauty was probably never allowed to leave the house, hidden from the world, and not given the opportunity to live a full life. The man frowned and stared ahead, his head propped up on his hand, his face reflecting an internal struggle and deep thought. Traces of discontent and tension from what was happening could be seen in his eyes. Calendia stood frozen by the half-open doors, hiding in the shadows and listening to the conversation, her heart beating faster. She tried hard not to make a sound, so as not to give herself away, being on the verge of hysteria. She was furious and horrified because her father had never shown her the love he had declared in the letter he had sent. There was no sincerity in his words, and now it became clear to her that all these expressions were just a mask. He needed money, a purse and gold coins, all of which were important for his ambitions and desire for luxury, but not for a connection with his own daughter, to whom he never paid due attention. The Count's family was greedy and wanted to live luxuriously. Their desire for wealth was immeasurable, and to achieve their goals, they stopped at nothing, ignoring human feelings and needs. The noblewoman folded her hands in front of her, silently asking the Duke not to believe her family's words. Her gaze filled with despair, as she could not allow her own family to influence her and her husband's fate. Suddenly, Christo announced, sitting at the table, that everything had been decided and they had to get ready. His voice was firm and decisive. He had already made his final decision, and now all that remained was to carry out what had been planned. The men's conversation was interrupted by a beauty who burst into the room and shouted that she would return home and repay the entire debt. The words sounded like a challenge, full of determination and pride. Her face was lit up with a bright fire of confidence. The young men, stunned by the unexpected appearance of a woman at such a late hour, froze in place, unable to hide their surprise, because they did not expect to encounter a lady in such a situation. The girl standing before them firmly promised that she would work with all her might to help her father pay off the entire amount of debt they had accumulated and restore the trust that had been lost. The room suddenly became so silent that it seemed as if the air between people had frozen, heavy with unspoken words and unresolved questions hanging in tension. Christo, frowning and trying to maintain a serious look, asked a direct question. Had the bride really been listening to their conversation all this time? Hiding, as if trying to remain unnoticed. The girl, bowing her head and folding her hands in front of her in a humble gesture, quietly but sincerely asked for forgiveness for her inappropriate behavior, hoping that she could be given a chance to correct the mistakes she had made. The man, ignoring any attempts to justify herself on the part of the lady, with cold severity reminded her that he had previously made it clear that she should not worry about her financial situation or interfere in his affairs. The butler, noticing the heated passions and the escalating argument, tried to intervene, waving his hands to attract attention, and respectfully addressed his master, trying to calm the situation. Christo, not wanting to waste a minute on further conversation, interrupted the butler, coldly saying that he did not intend to continue the discussion, since all these empty words were unpleasant to him. Calendia suddenly remembered that in exchange for the Duke's help, she had made a terrible promise to end his life, and, overcome by an internal struggle, she painfully pulled out the sword that had already pierced his heart. Overwhelmed by anger and despair at what she had done, she clenched her teeth so hard that it seemed she could break them, internally refusing to accept her new role as a killer, which seemed completely alien to her. For a brief but painfully clear moment, she felt as if the shadow of death had appeared right behind her, whispering in a cold, commanding voice that she must be an obedient girl and not try to resist fate under any circumstances. The men in the room seemed petrified, astonished by the unexpected appearance of a stranger who, by invading their home without warning, had disrupted the usual order of their lives, and caused a tense silence. The god of death, slightly bowing his head and looking at Calendia with a mysterious smile, muttered in a quiet but piercing voice that in this world, souls as pure and kind as hers were rare. After a short pause, which filled the room with oppressive silence, he added with a mocking note that for the Duke, Calendia had always been nothing but a useless burden and a waste of precious time. The Duke, overcome with anger and indignation, could not bear the mockery of the divine being, shouted loudly, demanding that the god of death immediately leave the noblewoman alone, and, snatching a magic blade, moved to attack. However, the god, maintaining an icy calm, without even resorting to his powers, easily repelled his furious blow with just one hand, as if playfully showing his absolute power. The aristocrat, aware of the risk, but driven by a sense of duty, stood up as a true defender, shielding the bride with his figure, trying to protect her from the threat that emanated from the powerful creature. The handsome and majestic god of death, not hiding his mocking nature, said with a slight grin that all of them present here were rude people who were completely incapable of respecting higher powers. Christo, instantly taking a fighting stance and tensing every muscle in his body, asked the god of death a sharp question, trying to maintain confidence in his voice. What, they say, was the Lord of the Dead doing here? The lady, hearing who their mysterious guest really was, the one who dared to cast a curse on the Duke, froze in place, overcome with surprise and a feeling of deep inner trepidation. The god of death, completely indifferent to what was happening around him, calmly raised his hand and slightly adjusted his cap, as if to make it clear that nothing that was happening could cause him the slightest inconvenience. After this, without changing his imperturbable tone, he turned to the Duke, telling him not to waste his nerves in vain and to calm down, because his visit was not at all for his soul and had completely different goals. However, the Duke, overcome with rage and distrust, was in no hurry to lower his sword, and the magical energy continued to swirl around him like an invisible storm, filling the air with power and tension. At that moment, with a light and seemingly casual movement, the boy with bright pink hair waved his hand to the side, as if to drive away boredom, and lazily closed his eyes, muttering that he had long been unbearably bored. The noblewoman standing to the side attracted the attention of the god of death, who, although accustomed to strange events, could not hide his surprise. She did not at all look like someone who would be able to remove such a powerful curse. In response to the young man's desperate cry, which rang out in the tense silence of the room, the god of death asked with a mocking intonation whether he had really forgotten about one very important and key detail of everything that was happening. It soon became clear that it made no difference whose soul, the girl's or the boy's, would be the one to lift the curse from the Duke. It was all just a game of circumstances and the choice of fate. When the god of death laughed loudly, as if he found everything that was happening incredibly funny, the nobleman could not contain his anger, calling him a scoundrel whose actions went beyond all understanding and morality. But at that very moment, the Lord of the Dead suddenly changed his mood. His expression became stern and serious, and he, looking intently at his interlocutors, asked a cold question: why the blade was still stuck in his friend's stomach. His insanely bright yellow eyes, like glowing sparks, shone with curiosity and interest, as if he was ready to absorb every word and movement that was happening around him, watching it all with pleasure. Beautiful but deadly, like a rose with sharp thorns, the god of death said with cold mockery, turning to his ward, that didn't he dream of death, having lost all the people who were dear and important to him? Calendia, hearing how many dear people her fiancé had lost, froze in thought, absorbed in the thought of what a difficult and painful path he had to go through, and what an enormous amount of pain he had experienced. With deep sadness, she reflected on how terrible was the fate that had fallen with such cruel cynicism on the Duke's shoulders, and how lonely he had been all this time, despite his high position. Riley suddenly intervened, raising his hand in a confident gesture as if to attract attention, determined to intervene in the conversation and break the growing tension that had settled all around. The butler, puzzled and completely at a loss, turned to his masters and asked who they had been talking to all this time, since there was no sign that anyone could be nearby except themselves. The young men, who had not expected such a turn of events, froze in place, amazed to learn that their friend had not seen the god of death, about whom everyone was talking, as if he were some mythical creature that no one could meet. The god of death, as if not paying attention to the anxiety in their eyes, with a slight ironic smile, declared that it was time for him to leave. But before that, he reminded them that the lady had to remove the blade from the Duke's body before her death, as this was her inevitable fate. In the blink of an eye, in a bright flash of red light, the man disappeared, as if he had dissolved into thin air, leaving behind only a shadow in the memory of those who witnessed this strange and mysterious phenomenon. 3 days passed, and the red roses continued to bloom in the garden, blossoming and filling the air with fresh scents, like symbols of inevitability and beauty that did not cease to exist despite the events that had happened recently. The noblewoman, in deep concentration, carefully watered the flowers in the garden, filling the watering can with water and carefully watching the drops fall on the delicate petals, as if trying to restore harmony around herself. Suddenly, her loneliness was interrupted by a small creature, which, making a funny sound, attracted the girl's attention, breaking the silence and calmly filling the space with its presence. Calendia, noticing the animal, sat down next to it, greeting it with a kind smile and joy in her eyes, as if this creature brought with it a piece of comfort and tenderness at that moment. She began to gently and carefully stroke the fur of the little animal, who, feeling the warmth of her hands, began to purr pleasantly, as if expressing his gratitude for the attention and comfort that she had given him. The girl's thoughts were about what an important person she herself might have lost or could have lost in her life, reflecting on the meaning of relationships that can sometimes be lost before they have time to fully blossom. Sitting in the garden, surrounded by greenery and flowers, she couldn't help but think about how important that man had been to her fiancé in the past, and what mark he had left on his life, the echoes of which were still felt in her heart. Suddenly, unexpectedly for herself, the girl heard a familiar voice behind her, which made her shudder with fear, since she did not expect that someone would break the silence of this secluded moment. It was Cristo, who had just arrived to visit his bride, with the special intention of enjoying the scent of the flowers that filled the garden and sharing his presence with those who were so dear to him. Embarrassed, Calendia stood up abruptly, trying to hide her emotions, and couldn't help but wonder if the Duke had heard her recent musings about the past, or if it had all gone unnoticed in his world of cares and obligations. The girl froze, holding back the emotions on her face when she heard the nobleman, noticing the worry in her eyes, express concern for her condition, which certainly caused her mixed feelings. The handsome man, with slight embarrassment and a serious expression on his face, explained that after the appearance of the god of death, a lot had changed in their lives, and their communication had become completely different, as if an unknown force had intervened in their relationship. There was a moment of awkward silence between the nobles as they stood opposite each other in the garden, not knowing what to say, and at some point feeling the space between them becoming increasingly tense. Suddenly, breaking the silence, Calendia loudly declared that she was not afraid of her death, as if trying to gain strength and self-confidence, deciding that no threats or fates could break her spirit. She wanted to say more, but the words seemed to get stuck in her throat, as if an invisible barrier prevented her from expressing her feelings, and each attempt to speak ended in a silence that became increasingly uncomfortable. She wanted to reach out and squeeze his hand tightly in hers, to feel the warmth and support that could convey all those unexpressed emotions that were boiling inside. But she hesitated, not knowing what would happen next. The lady became attached to her fiancé with all her soul and heart, not wanting to lose him for a minute, because her affection for him was so deep that the thought of separation seemed impossible and painful. The Duke, noticing her silence, said softly but confidently that if a lady had something important, she should share her thoughts without hiding them, so as not to leave room for omissions and ambiguities. Cristo always cared for the noblewoman with great sincerity and care, showing patience and deep affection. He stood by her side, waiting for her to finally decide to open up her feelings and thoughts to him. The lady's fingers gripped the hem of her dress tightly, trying to find some sort of support that could help her cope with the excitement that overwhelmed her as she stood before her fiancé. And the other hand involuntarily extended a finger forward, as if telling her that the time for an answer had come. And, despite her doubts, she must act and express everything that had accumulated in her soul. Calendia held her hand out in front of her, asking the nobleman with concern in her voice What would happen if she asked him to draw his sword now, as if she expected him to take some decisive action that would change the course of events? The Duke, taken aback by such an unexpected question, froze in shock. His face remained serious, and the wind ruffled his hair, adding even more tension to this moment, when all attention was focused on his reaction. The noblewoman, as if suddenly having made a decision, as if she was ready to put an end to her fiancé's suffering and perhaps ease his pain, was ready to help him pull out the blade that had long become his heavy burden. Christo, seeing that such a proposal came from her, could not contain his irritation and rage. His teeth clenched, and his eyes blazed with anger. He could not understand why she decided on such a dangerous thought. Calendia, turning her gaze towards her fiancé, firmly and decisively declared that, if he wished, she was ready to help him end his suffering and even help him die, demonstrating that her love for him knew no bounds. The aristocrat looked away awkwardly, lost in thought, trying to find the right words to answer his bride's request, because his thoughts were as vague as a fog hiding the truth. The nobleman could not decide, tormented by internal doubts. Should he choose death in order to meet the one who was so dear to him, or continue his path, living with the heavy burden of loneliness and fear? The hand that had been on his stomach suddenly clenched, the fingers instinctively tensing, as if it were trying to contain the pain or hide from others the internal struggle that threatened to break out. In the guy's body, hidden from prying eyes, there was a blade sticking out, which was like an invisible threat, an alien and dangerous element that left only traces of a bloody marker on his skin, like a harbinger of imminent trouble. Calendia, noticing the subtle doubts on her fiancé's face, realized that something was wrong with him, and her heart sank with anxiety, because she felt that something inside him had changed, and her anxiety only grew. When Calendia, unable to contain her feelings, reached out her hand to touch her fiancé, he suddenly rudely slapped her hand away, as if afraid that her warmth might reveal his inner feelings. The lady froze with her hand raised, shocked by his cruel act. Her heart sank in shock, and her eyes darted in surprise and pain, not understanding how the man she trusted so much could do such a thing. Christo opened his mouth to apologize for his behavior and perhaps explain his strange reaction, but he stopped mid-sentence, as if something had broken inside him, and the words stuck in his throat, not wanting to come out. At that moment, as if in response to the tension between them, the beast that had been lurking on the edge of their attention made a sharp leap and flew over them, bringing with it an explosive gust of air that seemed to take their breath away, as if wishing to protect its mistress. The beast, rushing forward, fell with force right on the Duke's face, as if trying to show its devotion and readiness to fight for her to the last. The girl, initially frightened but deciding to come closer, carefully approached the nobleman, who found himself on the ground with the animal, stunned and lying on the grass, as if the world itself had collapsed beneath him. The Duke, who had quickly come to his senses, began to curse and furiously try to fight off the beast, which, as if ignoring his protests, ran briskly over his shoulders, causing him to lose patience and composure. Grabbing the animal by the body with determination, the Duke, despite all the efforts of the beast, carried it aside, sternly ordering it to stop its restless behavior, hoping that it would obey his command. Calendia, unable to contain herself, could not resist the absurdity of what was happening, and began to laugh at this ridiculous situation, where the hero and his beast fought with unimaginable determination, but looked rather comical. Christo stood motionless, making no attempt to free himself from the clutches of the little beast, while his gaze was fixed on the laughter of the noblewoman, enchanted by her beauty, which he could not help but notice. He felt his heart beat faster with admiration. With joy, like a true beauty, she lifted the animal into the air, loudly and cheerfully exclaiming how cute and strong this creature was, and its expressive eyes sincerely touched everyone who was nearby. The Duke, who was watching this moment, could not help but smile, looking at the face of his beloved, which was illuminated by the light of happiness, and his heart was filled with tenderness and peace, making him forget about all his worries. After this, he gave his answer, in which he said that he was not going to pull out the blade that remained in his stomach yet, assuring that it was not serious enough to bother him at a time when her joy was so important. The aristocrat, tenderly and lovingly, touched his companion's cheek with his hand, feeling her soft skin and understanding how important it was to maintain this moment of closeness, in which everything seemed to be in perfect harmony. Happily, with a confident smile, the guy declared that he was glad to save their contract and marriage, assuring his beloved that their relationship would be strong despite all the trials that still lay ahead. They stood in the garden, their faces so close that each could feel the other's breath, and there was a light atmosphere of romance around them, as if time had stopped for this couple. The animal, tired of the adventure, curled up on the beauty's lap, settled comfortably, and soon fell asleep, while its calm breathing harmoniously fit into the silence of this enchanting moment. Soon the crown prince came to visit them and greeted them joyfully, his face glowing with genuine joy, and his presence added even more solemnity to this pleasant moment. Riley stood by, ready to serve tea to his masters, watching closely what was happening, not interfering, but always ready to provide support, like a faithful servant devoted to his role and duties. Suddenly, the heir to the throne put his hand to his mouth, jokingly saying that the Duke was probably jealous of his bride for the animal, hinting at their closeness, which caused him mixed feelings of surprise and displeasure. Christo, outraged by such a daring joke, reacted sharply, which only made the prince laugh louder, enjoying the reaction of his interlocutor and remaining confident in his ease and carelessness. And then, as if by fate, the little animal, feeling the tension, suddenly grabbed the man by the hand, his sharp fangs digging deep into the skin, and the prince jumped to the side from the pain, grabbing the bruised place with his finger. Ferdinand jumped back in pain, clutching his finger, which the little animal had managed to seriously injure, and his face reflected pain mixed with surprise at such an unexpected turn of events. The beauty, with a soft and caring look, gently stroked the beast's head, calming him down, while the ladies continued to seriously discuss important issues with the men, not noticing how this scene gave the conversation a light informality. The Duke, noticing his bride's reaction, suggested that she leave the pet at their home if she had become so attached to it, and his voice was full of benevolent ease, as if it were the most natural proposal. Calendia, hearing this proposal, was sincerely pleased and a little surprised, because she did not expect that everything would turn out so simply, and sparks of joy and gratitude for such a gesture sparkled in her eyes. Christo gave his consent with a slight mockery, watching as the pet, as if in response to everything that was happening, bit the prince again, smiling, not hiding his pleasure at this turn of events. The girl, looking down, realized that she had to come up with a name for the new tenant of their house, and this task seemed important to her, because this name depended on how the little animal would be perceived in their family. The little animal stared at his new owner in anticipation, as if in complete anticipation, his eyes shining with curiosity, and he knew that changes were coming soon, and the name would be a symbol of new life in this house. When the animal heard that he had been given a new name, Rita, he rejoiced and wagged his tail, feeling that this name suited him perfectly, as if it were part of his essence. The happy pet, not wanting to miss the moment, climbed onto his owner's neck, licking it generously, expressing his joy and gratitude for the attention she gave him. Suddenly, at that very moment, a new, wonderful idea occurred to the heir to the throne, which could further enliven the atmosphere, and his face lit up with genuine enthusiasm, as if he had found a solution to some important problem. He asked with interest why the bride and groom had not yet called each other by name, since it would seem that their relationship had long since moved to a more intimate and less formal stage. The young couple stared at the speaker, realizing that they hadn't really thought about the importance of addressing each other less formally, since such little things could make their communication more natural and warm. Clapping his hands, Ferdinand intervened, suggesting that Calendia call the Duke by name first, thus pushing them towards a more personal and informal communication that could help them in the future. Smiling broadly, the prince confirmed that the sooner they start training and getting used to it, the easier it will be for them at the upcoming event, because at such events, it is important to look confident and natural. Calendia froze with a sad expression on her face, realizing that she could not refuse the heir to the throne's offer, because her indecision would only complicate the situation, and the prince was clearly expecting some kind of step forward from her. An awkward silence fell between the nobles. No one knew what to say, and everyone felt the atmosphere becoming a little tense, because no one wanted to break convention and start a conversation first. After a pause, the aristocrat suddenly smiled, and, with a slight apologetic smile, called the Duke, addressing him as Mr. Arno, thus trying to soften the awkwardness of the situation a little and get closer to him. The Duke froze, his mouth slightly open in surprise, and sweat immediately appeared on his face. He clearly did not expect such a turn of events, and his confusion at the way she called him was quite noticeable. The prince, watching the proceedings with admiration, began to applaud, praising the lady for how skillfully she had handled the task, thereby creating a lighter atmosphere and confirming that everything had gone well. After this, she turned to her friend and, with a playful smile, said that it was now his turn, urging him to continue the game or follow her in this new ritual. But Christo suddenly jumped up from his seat and, with fury in his voice, declared that he had no intention of continuing this conversation, his words sounding firm, as if he was ready to end this situation once and for all, without giving any further explanations. Without thinking twice, the man turned around and walked out of the room with determination, his movements quick and confident, as if he wanted to get rid of the tense atmosphere that hung in the air as quickly as possible. The aristocrat slammed the door behind him, leaving behind only echoes and confusion, his footsteps echoing in the silence, and the rest of the room filled with incomprehension and questions, as if everything that was happening was elusive and unpredictable. Sitting in his office, the Duke held his head in his hands, sighing heavily. His face was lined with fatigue, and he felt like every breath he took was weighed down by the weight of frustration and inner conflict that made him feel like he was on edge. He thought to himself that he had not been feeling very well lately, and seemed to have even fallen ill. His body seemed to be exhausted, and his spirit was losing its fortitude, as if some invisible illness were fettering his strength. A memory of the heir to the throne's proposal to switch to a less formal communication with the bride arose in his mind, and these words did not give him peace, forcing him to think whether there was some deep meaning hidden in them that he did not fully understand. Leaning back in his chair, he continued his thoughts, smearing the thoughts in his head that, in fact, it did not matter how they addressed each other, because things like names could not change the essence of their relationship. Suddenly, the nobleman began to look around, as if he felt the presence of something sinister. His gaze darted around, and a strange feeling arose in his soul, as if he was looking for the god of death himself, ready to appear before him at any moment. Red with embarrassment, he felt incredibly awkward at the thought of his beloved, as if her image evoked such a flood of emotions in him that he could not hold back either his gaze or his thoughts. Suddenly, there was a banging of a fist on the door, which interrupted his thoughts and made him turn sharply, as if something important demanded his attention, and every sound seemed even louder in the silence. Jumping up from his seat, the Duke asked excitedly who the guest was, his voice betraying anxiety, because he was not expecting a visit, and the unexpected appearance of someone could disturb his calm and concentration. It was Calendia, who, with a slight smile, asked her fiancé if he could spare her a little time, and there was something in her eyes that made him immediately forget about everything else. The noblewoman stopped near the desk of the handsome man who was sitting. Her steps were confident and graceful, and now it seemed that she became the center of his attention, as if at that moment everything around became silent, and only she existed. Calendia leaned forward, politely apologizing for taking up her fiancé's time, her voice soft and respectful, as if she was concerned for his comfort, understanding how important his space was to him. The man, his mouth open in surprise, began to protest, because they were already married and everything was fine. But his words sounded a little nervous, as if he didn't know how to properly respond to her apology. Suddenly, the Duke jumped up from his seat and shouted that he did not want to return to what had happened between them before. His face turned red with embarrassment, and his words came out with difficulty, as if he was trying to free himself from old burdens. The girl tilted her head in surprise, but did not argue. Her gaze was full of softness and understanding, as if she realized that sometimes in a relationship, you need to let everyone express their feelings without creating pressure. Covering his face with his hands and hiding his embarrassment, the guy asked his bride to call him by name. His voice was quiet but sincere, as if he wanted their relationship to become closer and more natural, without unnecessary formalities. The aristocrat froze when he heard the lady's response to call her by her name. His gaze became more intense, and he seemed to realize anew that their relationship should become more personal and free from formalities. Calendia smiled, looking sweet and beautiful. Her face lit up with warmth and sincerity, and this simple yet graceful smile seemed to melt the tension, filling the space with light, after which the lady asked her future husband if they would have to dance together at the ball. Her voice sounded with a slight intrigue, and she could not hide her curiosity, asking this question, as if checking how he would react. The noblewoman looked away in embarrassment, lowering her eyes slightly, and admitted that no one had taught her to dance. Her words were quiet, full of awkwardness, because she did not expect that such a simple thing could become a topic of discussion. This was a real shock to the Duke, for the maiden was the daughter of an earl, and his surprise was evident, as if he could not believe that a girl of her kind had no experience in something so natural and important as dancing. The man stood up from his seat and offered his help in teaching the lady the art of dance. His words sounded confident, and they contained that ease with which he always helped others, without thinking about himself. Christo grabbed the beauty's waist and twirled her around in his arms. His movements were smooth and confident, and his face expressed not only determination, but also some persistence, as if he was ready to teach her everything he knew. Music was playing in the room, and the guy began to teach his companion the basics of movement. His voice was soft, and he explained each step with patience, filling the space not only with sounds, but also with an atmosphere of fun. The aristocrat herself admitted with a strained smile that she rarely left her adoptive father's house. Her words were barely audible, as if she was embarrassed by her confession. But in her eyes, one could see gratitude for the opportunity to learn something new. The guy took a step forward, his gaze focused, and he pushed her to new movements, feeling how not only understanding in dance was growing between them, but also something more that was still hidden in their relationship. Intrigued, the Duke asked why Calendia left the house so rarely, his gaze full of genuine curiosity, and he hoped for a frank answer. But his words still sounded soft and delicate, to which he received the answer that the beauty herself did not know why she stayed at home, as if she could not explain what exactly was keeping her within these walls, and her eyes were momentarily clouded with anxiety, as if she was trying to avoid an unpleasant topic of conversation. Suddenly, horror passed through the boy's body when he heard the words that the lady's family did not particularly love her, since she was adopted. The words caught his soul like an icy wind, and he felt the weight of the situation, which was far from as bright as he imagined. The nobleman's hand clenched into a fist in rage, his fingers tensed and clenched until they turned white, and the inner fire of anger, like an avalanche, was ready to burst out when he realized how unfairly his beloved had been offended. Hatred and rage emanated from the Duke like a dark storm, engulfing his soul, because he could not forgive those who dared to offend his beloved. And now this anger turned into a flame, ready to devour everything in its path. Calendia froze, feeling her heart skip a beat as she saw the nobleman's mood change abruptly. His face became dark and tense, his gaze full of worry and determination, which made her feel something was wrong. The lady clutched the hem of her dress with her hands, feeling disappointed at her own words, which seemed to be more wrong than could have been, and it became clear to her that perhaps it would have been better for her to remain silent than to reveal her feelings at such a moment. Suddenly, Christo, breaking the silence, spoke up, declaring that he did not consider the bride a loser or a bad person, thereby softening the atmosphere, and it seemed that his words were full of sincerity and a desire to support her in this difficult moment. Embarrassed, with a slight blush on her cheeks, Calendia froze, pressing her hand to her chest, not knowing how to react to such an unexpected turn of events, and her thoughts froze, as if trying to understand the meaning of what was said. The handsome man, looking at what was happening, decided to himself that if he decided to go against the Count for revenge, then he should first find out more about the bride and her past, because before making a decision, he must understand all the details of this situation. At the celebration to which they had received an invitation, numerous nobles had gathered, and, as always in such cases, rumors began to spread, mixing with light whispers behind their backs, where each piece of news was overgrown with new details. Suddenly, a woman's hand grabbed the man's shirt and pulled it towards herself, attracting everyone's attention. Her gesture was decisive, as if she could not afford to hesitate, waiting for someone who could answer her silent challenge. The beauty, smiling softly, whispered to her lover to dance with her a little longer. Her words sounded like an absolute demand, and her gaze was full of that very charm that could not be refused. The Duke could not refuse her, and despite all the formalities, he agreed to help her learn the dance, feeling how a connection was developing between them that transcended the boundaries of social rules. Soon they were both spinning around the room, their bodies merging in the dance, and it seemed like time had slowed down, allowing them to enjoy the moment without thinking about the world outside this beautiful hall. There was only a week left until the celebration, and the atmosphere was becoming more and more tense, as if the air was filled with the anticipation of this special day. And the mansion they were all in stood as if in anticipation of the inevitable event. The two men were playfully fighting with each other. Their laughter and words sounded cheerful, but behind this carefree behavior, there was a tense situation. The prince did not want to leave the Duke's house, while Christo himself was trying to drive out the pretender to the throne as soon as possible. The days passed quickly, as if the darkness was swallowing up time, and day after day there was a special silence in the house, while beneath the surface of events the tension grew, creating a feeling that everything was about to change. With each new dance lesson, Calendia became more confident in her movements. Her grace and dexterity developed, and it was already noticeable how she was learning to feel the music, gradually merging with its rhythm. Riley patiently helped the girl master the rules of etiquette, teaching her table manners. Every word of his was like an instruction, and her desire to learn and improve added sincerity to this process. They also did not forget about collecting things, carefully collecting everything that could be useful to them on the road. Each item was carefully selected, so as not to forget anything important that could be useful on the further journey. Christo froze, holding the box with the decoration in his hand, looking at it thoughtfully, his gaze focused, as if this small object contained some deep meaning that he was trying to understand or appreciate. Soon the day came when they had to leave the mansion and go to the event, and the atmosphere of farewell was filled with a strange combination of excitement and anticipation, because every step now led them into the unknown. Calendia said goodbye to the butler, her voice quiet but filled with gratitude, while her fiancé was already boarding the carriage, preparing for the journey ahead. While the feelings of farewell were mixed with the hope of a quick meeting, the two of them waved goodbye before heading out on their way, their gesture full of respect and politeness. But at the same time, there was a slight sadness in it as they left this place behind. The carriage set off, the wheels pumping on the soft road, and the butler, standing at the door of the mansion, looked after them, his gaze filled not only with farewell, but also with quiet sadness from the fact that this was, perhaps, the last moment of their meeting. The carriage drove through the forest. The nature around filled the air with freshness, and the road, winding among the trees, led along green expanses, where the horses pulling the cart brought them closer to their next destination with each step. Calendia took a big bite of food with pleasure, her face expressing true pleasure as she devoured the juicy sandwich, forgetting about everything in the world and enjoying the moment of simple pleasure. She loudly declared to her fiancé that the sandwich was incredibly delicious. Her words sounded with such genuine joy that he couldn't help but smile, because her enthusiasm was infectious, making him also have a little fun. The man sat opposite her, eating his food slowly and measuredly, his gaze focused and his movements calm. But despite this, one could detect in his eyes an interest in what she said. Riley, left alone in the mansion, must have felt very lonely, because the house where so many events happened now seemed empty, and silence filled every corner, leaving him alone with his own thoughts. The Duke, trying to reassure his bride, said that Riley was not alone, because Rita was with him, and although his words were encouraging, there was a note of anxiety in them, as if he was trying to convince himself of this too. The nobles sat close, their legs almost touching, creating a feeling of intimacy and trust, as if they were not just neighbors, but partners united by some invisible but strong alliance. Smiling, the girl agreed that Riley must not have been bored, because he had a small animal that could always amuse him and become his faithful friend in this lonely, albeit strange time. Christo smiled back, pleased that he had managed to cheer up his lady, his eyes sparkling with satisfaction, because it was important for him to see her mood, especially in moments like these when she was looking for support. He immediately covered his face with his hand, not wanting to reveal his emotions and joy. His face was hidden behind the gesture, as if he was trying to hide even the slightest manifestation of inner happiness, not wanting it to become noticeable. Tall trees rushed past, and the horse, as if sensing the fleetingness of time, rode quickly, carrying the carriage forward along the forest path, leaving behind only a trail of dust and the noisy sound of hooves that merged with the silence around. Looking out the window, Kalendia couldn't help but notice how beautiful the weather was outside. Clear skies, warm sunshine, and a gentle breeze created an atmosphere of peace that seemed to invite one to enjoy the moment. Since they still had a long way to go to the palace, the noblewoman suggested that her fiancé sleep a little, knowing that a long journey could tire them out, and a short rest along the way would help conserve strength for the upcoming events. Half an hour later, Kalendia herself did not notice how she fell asleep in the transport. Her body relaxed, her eyes closed, and she sank into a light, peaceful sleep, carried away into a world of dreams among the warm atmosphere of the carriage. The man watched his beloved from the side, worried that she might suddenly tilt her head too much in her sleep, and was afraid that this could lead to some unpleasant consequences, because her comfort was important to him. Getting up from his seat with the basket in his hands, he decided to move closer to her to be close, and thus provide her with additional peace of mind. His caring attention did not go unnoticed. Now Christo sat next to his bride, who was dozing. Her breathing was even and calm, and he watched her sleep with a smile, feeling his heart fill with warmth and a slight excitement from the closeness. When the beauty's head rested on the guy's strong shoulder, he shuddered with embarrassment, feeling her weight and warmth, which created an invisible but tangible closeness between them, making his heart beat faster. The aristocrat, after a little hesitation, decided to let her lie on top of him, and they continued on their way, moving in silence, where every moment was filled with new meaning, and his decision reflected care and respect for her. When Kalendia woke up, she began to blink rapidly, trying to come to her senses, as if she was just now realizing where she was, and her thoughts were a little confused, not yet having time to return to reality after the dream. Suddenly, her mouth opened wide, realizing that she was sitting next to the Duke, who, like her, was dozing, and she felt mixed feelings, surprise, embarrassment, and a slight warmth from the fact that he was nearby. Finally, they arrived in the capital. The aristocrats were walking the streets, enjoying the luxury of the city, while the market was in a lively atmosphere. Everything around was filled with the joy and splendor characteristic of the capital. Christo also woke up, blinking from the movement of the carriage, his eyes trying to get used to the bright light and new sounds, and his body still remembered the rest. But his attention quickly returned to what was happening around him. The children held balloons, running through the streets with joyful smiles, and their parents watched them happily. It was clear that a holiday was happening in the city, and the whole atmosphere was filled with fun and a light mood. Leaning against the carriage window, Kalendia watched the passers-by, her gaze smoothly gliding along the streets, where life was in full swing at its usual pace, and she curiously studied every movement, every detail along the way. The companion explained that everyone was looking at them like that because of the imperial family crest that was on their carriage, attracting the attention of everyone around as a symbol of power and prestige, radiating grandeur and importance. It turned out that their trip had been organized by the emperor himself, and the transport they were riding on slowly rolled along the streets, attracting the admiring glances of the townspeople, who could not help but notice this majestic procession. Kalendia placed her hand on the window and asked where they were going to spend the night, feeling a little uneasy about the unfamiliar place they were about to reach, and not knowing what to expect on this new stage of the journey. Turning his gaze to her, the Duke replied that they would be staying in the ruling family's castle the entire time, and his words were confident and calm, as if it were something completely natural for him. The young couple paused at the entrance to the palace, their steps slowing as they both stopped for a moment, breathing in the air filled with the grandeur and history of the place, realizing that their journey had come to an important moment. A bouquet of roses in a vase stood on a nightstand. Its bright petals were a luxurious accent in the interior, filling the room with a delicate aroma and elegance, creating an atmosphere of coziness and nobility. The long staircase led upward, many steps as if inviting them to new heights, promising new events and opportunities, and each step felt like an important approach to the next stage of their journey. The noblewoman stood awkwardly at the entrance, looking in surprise at the chambers they had arrived to, her gaze sliding over the majestic walls, the luxurious interior details, and everything that had been created in this place, like in a real palace. The beauty, without hiding her admiration, looked at the beautiful bouquet of flowers, enjoying its bright colors and subtle aroma, as if this small gift was a symbol of her stay in such a magnificent place. Noticing how quickly her fiancé was walking, Calendia asked him to stop and wait for her, because she had not yet had time to look around, and felt that in this place one could waste time without noticing the most beautiful details. Together, they walked out onto the balcony where a fresh wind blew, filling their hair with a light rustle, creating a feeling of freedom and peace, as if the air itself was greeting them, inviting them to enjoy the beauty of the world around them. Calendia gasped and clutched her neck at the sudden gust of air that felt stronger than she expected, and at that moment, her body reacted to the unexpected cold despite the warm day. A beautiful view of the fountain and nature, surrounded by greenery, opened up before them, like in a painting, where the calm waters of the fountain reflected the clear sky, and everything around was covered in the velvety light of the sunset. Calendia compared the courtyard to their garden, which, although also beautiful, seemed more modest and familiar, while here everything was majestic and unusual, as if she had entered a completely different world. Christo himself, smiling mysteriously, began to remember the past, childhood and youth. His gaze became a little dreamy, and he briefly plunged into memories, feeling how memory pulls him back to those moments that defined his life. Standing on the balcony, they each thought about their own things, enjoying the beauty of the landscape that opened up before them. And despite their different thoughts, it was obvious that everyone felt this silence and tranquility as something important for themselves. Suddenly, a servant appeared behind them, announcing that she had arrived to escort the young masters to their quarters, and her voice filled the space with a slight excitement, as a harbinger of the fact that the next moment would be no less significant. Their shared bedroom turned out to be large, with one soft bed, on which one could feel coziness and warmth. But this detail only increased the unusualness of the situation, creating a feeling of discomfort for both. The young couple froze. The girl stood embarrassed, and the guy stood angrily and shyly in front of one of the beds, not knowing how to react to such a strange surprise, which put them in an awkward position. Christo rushed to curse at the servant boy, asking why there was only one bed, his voice filled with rage and his eyes shining with indignation, while the servant looked completely stunned. The man was literally burning with anger. His face was red, and there was a strong sense of dissatisfaction in his actions, as if it were a personal insult that had forced him to act with such force. He grabbed the servant by the collar and lifted him into the air, threatening that if he did not receive an answer, the consequences would be unpleasant for him, and there was a threat in his voice that made the servant twitch with fear. It turned out that all this was a trick of the cunning prince, who was thus trying to bring the duke and the lady together, arranging an unexpected incident in order to bring them to a new stage in their relationship and achieve his personal goals. Then, Calendia suddenly spoke up, saying that they needed another room. Her words sounded confident, but there was a slight wariness to them, as if she was trying to avoid awkwardness. The guy raised his hands and began to apologize, saying that there were no free rooms. His face expressed sincere regret, and he was clearly at a loss, trying to find a way out of an unpleasant situation. Almost growling, the Duke ordered the boy to bring the heir to the throne here immediately. His voice was full of authority and determination, and there was a threat in it that this misunderstanding would not be left unattended. With her hands sadly folded in front of her, Calendia thought of how sorry she felt for the poor servant who had fallen victim to this clever game, and her sympathy pierced her heart despite the whole situation. She grabbed her husband's shirt tightly with her hand and pulled it towards her, feeling his gaze move in surprise to her impatient face. Immediately, Christo turned towards his gorgeous bride to understand what exactly she wanted to tell him, because her gaze was hiding some important hint. Smiling, Calendia tried to convince the charming, handsome man that she didn't really mind sleeping in the same room with him, despite all her shyness. Smiling happily, she added that she was very happy to share the same bed with him, despite the unpredictability of the situation, which caused the groom to smile quietly. Then, with a slight bow of her head, she leaned towards the servant and expressed her gratitude for the room provided, thereby sparing him from the groom's anger that might flare up. The boy, feeling relieved, began to cry, mentally thanking his savior, who had truly shown concern and indulgence towards his experiences. The servant bowed with reverence and respect before leaving, hiding behind his gesture his concern for the owners and their peace in this unpredictable world. Calendia, waving goodbye, expressed her gratitude for the support, fully aware that her actions had already contributed to the overall atmosphere of this situation. Suddenly, a man's hand shyly pulled at the hem of her dress, unable to hide his excitement, while everything around began to seem a little more tense. The Duke, flushed as a tomato, not knowing how to react to the situation, reminded the lady of her words about them sleeping together, feeling his embarrassment turning into anxiety and his heart beating faster with excitement. The man froze in front of this beautiful lady. His gaze could not tear itself away, and at the same time, he tried to calm his restless heart, which was beating incessantly in his chest, not giving him peace. The girl, realizing what the guy meant, smiled slightly and raised her finger up, as if confirming his thoughts and reassuring him, letting him know that everything would be fine and there was no reason to worry. Calendia said in a comforting and gentle tone that there was also a sofa here, so there was no need to worry about a place to sleep, as a solution could always be found, and the night's rest would be comfortable and carefree. Covering his face with his hands, the man calmed down a little, but still felt internal tension. Despite this, deep down, he was ready to spend the night next to his beloved, and this thought brought him comfort. Turning away and feeling slightly embarrassed, the Duke said discreetly that he would sleep on the sofa, and Calendia could calmly take the bed, providing her with complete comfort while he remained aside. The noblewoman did not like this proposal, because she felt uncomfortable that because of her, the groom was ready to sleep on an uncomfortable sofa, and she could not help but feel guilty for his noble, sacrificial behavior. Christo was indignant because he was a true gentleman and could not afford to remain indifferent when it came to the well-being of a lady, even if it meant causing some inconvenience to himself. The couple's eyes met, and the girl, with confidence in her eyes, was not going to back down from her decision, intending to insist on her own, so that the situation would be resolved the way she considered right. Raising her hand up, the girl suggested sleeping on the same bed, but at different ends, so that everyone would feel comfortable and not violate personal boundaries, while creating harmony in their night's rest. The bed was large enough for both of them to fit together, each in their own corner, but still close together, creating a feeling of comfort and security. Unable to resist the girl's stubbornness any longer, Christo agreed with a slight sigh, realizing that sometimes it was necessary to compromise in order to maintain harmony in a relationship. Night fell, and the castle sank into silence, falling asleep in its usual rhythm until a moment of peace and serenity came within its walls, which is so necessary for rest. The lady was getting ready for bed, already dressed in her nightgown, when suddenly her thoughts returned to her suitcases, and she remembered that she needed to take care of her things before she fell asleep. She sat down next to her bag, starting to arrange and unpack it, with a slight impatience, because things should be in their places so that everything would be in order before bed. The lady's mouth dropped open and her eyes were swollen with shock. She had not expected such a turn of events and was shocked, not knowing how to react to what was happening in front of her. Calendia froze in surprise when she opened the suitcase and saw its contents. Curled up in a ball, sleeping comfortably, her pet, who had somehow ended up inside, adding a funny surprise to her evening. Hearing the scream, Christo entered the room, worried, and immediately asked his beloved what happened, ready to provide support and understand what could have caused her concern. The noblewoman silently pointed to the animal, which, as it turned out, had gotten into the bag and gone with them, which surprised and at the same time made her feel awkward about the unexpected incident. Calendia sighed heavily, shook her head guiltily, and apologized to her future husband, admitting that she had not been keeping an eye on her pet and had not noticed him hiding in her bag. Christo, looking at her with understanding, gently replied that they would take care of the little animal because they could not leave him, especially in such a situation, and had to take care of him. Calendia smiled, feeling relieved and grateful that Christo had not become upset or angry, but had instead been patient and willing to solve the problem. As the lady bent down to pet the animal, her hand was suddenly stopped by a man's palm, gently but firmly placed on her wrist, as if warning her against something. Instead of continuing the conversation, the handsome man led his future wife to the bed, And the two of them, in the silence of the night, sat on the sheets, feeling how peace filled their hearts. After which the man, with a slight smile, handed the small gift box to the noblewoman. Her gaze met his, full of tenderness and expectation. At that moment, as never before, closeness and trust were felt. When Calendia opened the box, her eyes widened in surprise, for inside lay a precious ring, sparkling in the dim light of the room, a symbol of connection and eternity. Calendia froze in surprise when she learned that this decoration had been passed down in the Duke's family from generation to generation, becoming a legacy that only strengthened her impression each time. The aristocrat, with quiet sadness in her eyes, immediately returned the ring to her husband, asking him to take it back, because she could not accept such a gift, feeling that it was not her place for such an important symbol. She thought sadly to herself that this ring must have been worn by the girl he lost in the war, and perhaps she never had the chance to become his wife, leaving the Duke with this sad memory. The man took the box and looked at his bride intently, silently, as if trying to find the right words to explain to her the importance of what he was about to tell her. After a pause, he confessed that his younger brother was supposed to give this ring to his beloved, but fate decreed otherwise, and he tragically passed away, leaving this symbol of love in the past. The lady was surprised to learn that her lover had a twin brother, since she had never heard of him, and this news seemed to lift the curtain on the mysterious pages of his life, to which Christo, with a heavy look, added that his brother had died long ago. And it was not just a loss, but a great tragedy that left a deep mark on his heart. Covering her mouth with her hands, the girl realized with horror and sadness what had happened 50 years ago. Her heart sank with pain when she realized that this tragedy was much more terrible than she could have imagined. After all, right before the eyes of the Duke, his relative was killed, and this terrible scene remained forever in Christo's memory, leaving an indelible mark on his soul and heart. The two boys were walking through the garden, which was amazingly beautiful and smelled nice, and its luxurious plants created an atmosphere of peace and magic, like a place for dreams. The third boy ran behind them, clearly lagging behind his older brother and his friend, his face full of determination to catch up with them despite his slight fatigue. Two guys who looked similar but had different personalities stood next to each other, their differences perhaps creating tension, but in this context they were one, connected by strong bonds of friendship. The older brother extended his hand to the younger one, ready to help him at any moment, as if demonstrating that he would always be there, supporting and protecting him, despite all the difficulties. The younger boy laughed happily as he took his brother's hand, feeling happy and grateful, as it was a moment when his feelings were filled with confidence and warmth. Besides the twins, there was another guy with them with brown hair and a white shirt, who always stood out from the rest with his calm posture and attentive gaze. This boy dreamed of becoming the best butler when he grew up, and every day he delved deeper into his dreams, imagining how he would serve with dignity and professionalism. Christo, unlike his brother, had no tact and often expressed his thoughts directly, even if it sounded rude. He sincerely believed that there was no harm in dreaming, despite the doubts of others. The cheerful twin suggested that the others play tag around the garden, his eyes sparkling with energy and his laughter infectious, and everyone happily accepted his offer. Christo, looking at his brother a little worriedly, asked him if he would be able to run, since he had not been feeling well in the morning, and it seemed to him that he might get tired. The boy proudly replied that he was simply pretending and acting sick, as if he did not feel any fatigue, assuring his brother that he was ready for the game and would be on par with the others. Suddenly, a noble lady appeared behind them with a fan in her hands, clearly dissatisfied with the impudent boy's lie. Her stern gaze and tense posture betrayed her indignation. Brother Christo turned around in fear, realizing that he had been caught in a lie. His face turned red with embarrassment, and he panicked and looked for a way to justify himself to the stern lady. The pink-haired aristocrat was angry, her lips pressed into a thin line, and her frown gave her smile a cold, intense expression, as if she was not ready to forgive pranks. The younger twin stood behind his older brother, asking him to save him from the evil aunt, his eyes searching for support, and he looked with hope at the older one, ready to stand up for protection. Suddenly, the boys started running around the grown lady, trying to confuse her, their mischievous movements and quick steps creating a whirlwind of fun and a little chaos around her. Grabbing her by the hands, they began to ask questions about who was who, their curious voices sounding at the same time, creating confusion and a genuine desire to know her reaction. The girl smiled tensely, her eyes remained cold, and it was obvious that she was not happy with such pranks of children. Her face reflected slight irritation hidden behind a polite smile. As a result, the lady decided to punish two boys at once, who, laughing and throwing dust into the air, began to run away from the evil aunt, trying to avoid her stern gaze, but also realizing that punishment was inevitable. The head of the family, smiling tenderly, watched his family. His eyes were full of love and pride for his children, and in his soul there was peace, knowing that his loved ones were happy. The woman hugged her children, not knowing that this happiness would soon disappear, that in the future they would face trials that would change their lives forever. Several years later, the grown-up boys stood at the graves of their parents, each of them feeling the emptiness and invisible heaviness, standing in front of the place that left an indelible mark on their hearts. It was raining, and they could hardly hold back their tears, which mixed with the raindrops, feeling how the bitterness of loss engulfed their souls, despite all their efforts to hold back. One of the twins was sheltering the other from the rain, who stood without an umbrella, offering his shoulder as a shield from the raindrops, determinedly protecting him as they once protected each other. The younger one reassured the older one, saying that everything would be fine and that he was ready to become the head of the family, assuring him that at least in this matter, he could be a support and hope for both of them. Since then, Christo has decided to become stronger by practicing fencing daily to be prepared for any difficulties in life, to protect his family, and not to repeat the tragic experience of loss. And at the age of 18, Christo became the youngest general in history. His achievements became a real sensation, and his name went down in history as a symbol of strength and courage. Christo fought and won. His fame spread throughout the country, and he became known not only as a warrior, but also as a leader who could inspire his soldiers to victory. Newspapers began to write about him as an invincible hero, admiring his strategic genius and incredible bravery, and his face became increasingly recognizable. And the younger twin was happy for his brother's successes. With each new achievement, with each victorious battle, he became more and more proud of him, reading articles and burning with this excitement. He was always softer and more loyal, smiled more often, and was kind, not hiding his affection for his brother, despite all the cruelty of the surrounding world. And yet, 7 years later, tragedy struck. The war began, and in the midst of the fighting, the unimaginable happened. A fatal mistake was made in the flow of events. The men killed his brother before Christo's eyes, confusing the two twins in the confusion of battle, and he didn't have time to understand what had happened until he felt the cold blow of reality. People fought, fire and blood intertwined. The atmosphere of war consumed everything around, leaving only the memory of tragic loss and a bitter emptiness in Christo's heart. One of the boys shouted loudly, warning that something irreparable had happened, and they had confused the older twin with the younger. Realizing that the mistake had cost the life of the most precious person, driven by hatred and anger, Christo killed everyone indiscriminately with fury, as if not realizing the consequences of his actions, only wanting to avenge the death of his younger brother. The slowly dying twin smiled, despite the unbearable pain, trying to somehow calm his brother, who was losing his mind from rage and despair, forgetting about the true price of revenge. As a result, Christo was doomed to suffer and hate himself for being born a twin and for not being able to protect the one he always considered his other half. Calendia listened sympathetically to the story of her future husband, who had experienced so much pain and loss, and with each word she felt even greater respect and compassion for him. Clutching his head, Christo blamed himself for everything, believing that he should have died instead of his brother, unable to bear the weight of his guilt and realizing his helplessness. The twins were always inseparable, and even after 50 years, despite his power and status, the Duke could not forget his brother, continuing to carry his loss in his soul. The lady took the crying aristocrat into her arms, trying to give him at least a small piece of comfort that he had long lost, hoping that her love and support would help ease his pain a little. The noblewoman quietly, with barely noticeable sadness, whispered that if her husband's brother had not left him at that moment, their destinies would never have crossed, and she might have remained in the shadow of her past, never knowing what true freedom and happiness are. She could never escape from the home of her cold and cruel family, who shackled her soul, making her feel like a prisoner in her own home, deprived of the love, care, and warmth that she had sought for so long. In her life, she met many amazing people, such as a kind palace servant with gentle words and a patient look, and a kind prince who opened her eyes to a world filled with mercy and compassion. With a sincere and happy smile on her face, Kalendia admitted that she was immensely happy that their paths crossed, that meeting him became the turning point in her life that gave her hope for a bright future and true happiness. The man, flushed with excitement, held back the tears that were streaming down his cheeks, and his eyes shone with sincerity and deep love for his wife, who stood before him. Suddenly, he remembered the box with the ring that was lying next to him on the table, reminding him of an important moment that was supposed to be decisive in their lives. With a slight, outstretched hand, the boy carefully reached for the box, knowing that this ring was a symbol of their promise and the eternal bond they were about to seal. After Christo took the ring, he gently placed it on his beloved's finger, feeling his heart fill with happiness and pride for this important step in their relationship. With a smile on her face, the girl, with shining eyes, said that now she was his bride, that her soul was connected to him forever, and this moment would remain in her memory forever. The Duke, pressing his hands to his chest, felt how often his heart beat, filled with happiness, realizing that it was at that moment that he became the happiest man in the world. The girl, smiling and carefully watching her husband, worried about him, proud that she was able to become a part of his life, feeling that this was only the beginning of their journey together. Christo himself, despite his inner doubts and stubborn denial of his feelings, suddenly realized that perhaps he had actually become seriously ill with this wonderful, irresistible feeling of love. When the boy, having gathered his courage, was about to confess his feelings to the noblewoman, suddenly his face was attacked by a small animal that jumped right on him, depriving him of the opportunity to continue his thought. The man, confused and stunned, fell backwards onto the bed, and the little animal, sitting on his face, continued to move uncontrollably, as if not noticing the discomfort of its owner. The dissatisfied aristocrat, suffering from an awkward position and enduring all the antics of his pet, grimaced and tried to keep himself within the bounds of politeness, although his every gesture expressed irritation. A loud and furious scream echoed throughout the castle as the owner, hearing the noise, ordered her pet to calm down immediately, hoping that her words would bring the situation back under control. The beautiful noblewoman, sighing with shame, apologized to her husband for the animal's bad behavior, although it was obvious that her pet did not understand at all what he was guilty of. The little animal, despite all this noise and discontent, looked pleased with itself and sat proudly on the man's face, clearly enjoying its role as domestic dictator. The pet, sitting on his owner's lap, radiated contentment, as if he understood that his behavior deserved praise and attention. He purred happily, enjoying the moment. Christo, closing his eyes from fatigue, quietly said that he did not expect so much attention and mischief from this wild animal, but it seemed to be always ready to surprise. Moreover, the pet was madly attached to his mistress and was ready to protect her at any moment, not paying attention to others, with complete devotion and loyalty. The noblewoman, hugging her pet, felt how his warmth and softness freed her from loneliness. She stroked him tenderly, feeling that with him by her side, she was not afraid of either loneliness or worries. The Duke watched his contented wife with a smile, not hiding his joy at how happy she was, and how her presence with this little friend brought her peace and quiet. However, Kalendia, having scratched her pet behind the ear, began to gently scold him, explaining that attacking someone without reason is absolutely unacceptable, and such actions need to be corrected. The young couple went to bed, each on their own side of the bed, sharing space, but each, despite the closeness, was absorbed in their own thoughts and experiences. However, unlike his innocent and calm wife, Christo could not fall asleep so easily. His eyes remained open, and the tension in his body did not allow him to relax, forcing him to toss and turn in search of peace. Getting out of bed and deciding not to disturb the lady with his anxiety, the man headed to the sofa, believing that it would be better for him to sleep there so as not to disturb her peace, since she was an innocent maiden who did not deserve unnecessary worries. But suddenly, hearing his beautiful wife, still deep in sleep, call tenderly and plaintively for her mother, He froze in place, feeling something alarming grip his heart. Tears began to appear in the eyes of the sleeping beauty, quietly rocking on the pillow, and her face was distorted by the nightmare that seemed to not leave her even in her sleep, leaving traces of fear and pain. The Duke, with sadness in his heart, reflected that since Calendia was an adopted daughter, her parents had gone as quickly as his own, leaving her with a void that was difficult to fill. But despite everything, Calendia grew up to be a smart, kind, and strong woman, capable of coping with any difficulties, and he was proud of what she had become. Taking strands of his wife's hair in his hands, Christo, kissing them tenderly, made her a promise. Now it was his turn to protect her, to be there and support her in all her endeavors, promising that he would be her support in any storm. The day of the celebration arrived, and the aristocrats gathered in the magnificent hall walked along its spacious corridors, enjoying the festive atmosphere and the grandeur of the event. Isabella, dressed in a new, expensive pink dress, made young gentlemen fall off their feet with admiration and love. Her beauty drove crazy everyone who looked at her. However, the true goal of the vile lady was not these weak, loving hearts, but that mysterious man from the street, whom she had noticed long ago, and who attracted her with his mysterious appearance. Turning around, looking around the hall, the maiden realized that this strange stranger, who had interested her so much, had not yet arrived at the ball, which made her heart beat faster in anticipation of the meeting. The girl felt sad when she thought that the mysterious guy who caught her attention might not be mysterious and special at all, but just an ordinary person, not worth her time and worries. Suddenly, in the midst of conversation and noisy anticipation, the announcement of the arrival of Duke Christo was heard, which immediately attracted the attention of all those present, filling the hall with excitement and curiosity. Using her irresistible beauty, Isabella decided to approach passing men, trying to find out more about the strange aristocrat who seemed so mysterious and inaccessible. The men, unable to resist her charm, blushed and struggled to formulate their thoughts, which only emphasized her power and attractiveness. From their hesitant conversations, the beauty learned that the aristocrat she so passionately wanted to understand already had a wife, which suddenly threw her into slight confusion and made her think about his life. The boys instantly stopped talking when they heard a loud laugh coming from the lady, attracting the attention of everyone in the room as soon as her laughter broke the peace. The lady, covering her mouth with her hand, mockingly called the nobleman's chosen one a very greedy person, making fun of her naivety as if it were something obvious to everyone except the girl herself. Calendia was something like a white, innocent flower with such a fragile and pure soul that it could easily be defamed, and this was exactly the kind of sacrifice Isabella was counting on. Isabella, hiding her vile smile behind her fan, hid her true nature, realizing that her manipulations were just beginning, and she would use every chance to achieve her goal. With a smile full of rage, the girl silently forgave her negligent sister, thinking that she had married the old man not out of love, but solely because of her weakness and stupidity. Meanwhile, Calendia, walking next to her husband towards the entrance to the hall where the important event was taking place, felt her heart beating heavily with excitement, while her hand tightly held Christo's. She was very worried. Her soul was tormented by fears, because she had to face again the family that once despised and hated her, leaving scars on her heart. Calendia felt a tremor in her heart as she faced the prospect of seeing the family that hated her again, and her emotions grew more intense as long-forgotten memories came alive again. The maiden's blue eyes, full of anger and suffering, sparkled like fire, reflecting all her inner experiences and the pain that her past still left deep scars. Suddenly, hearing her name being spoken, the beauty quickly turned around, and her gaze met an unusual sight that made her heart skip a beat. Before her stood the Duke, who, having dropped to one knee, attracted everyone's attention to himself, thereby causing surprise and admiration among those present in the hall. The man solemnly swore an oath that with the ring he had given her, which became a symbol of their love, he would always protect his wife and stand by her side, no matter what the difficulties. He asked her not to worry about anything, but just to enjoy the ball, filling her heart with warmth and confidence that her life would now be in good hands. Calendia smiled and felt a heavy weight fall from her heart, a feeling of complete support that made her believe in the future and in the strength of their relationship. The noblewoman expressed her gratitude to her companion, looking at him warmly and with a smile on her face, feeling how his presence gave her confidence and peace. Now her fingers were tightly gripping his shoulder, unwilling to let go, as if sensing the safety and support he was providing her at this important moment. At that moment, the doors opened with a characteristic ringing sound, and a voice was heard that loudly and solemnly announced the arrival of the Duke and Duchess, causing everyone present to explode with curiosity. The two of them stood at the threshold, preparing to take the decisive step forward to appear before high society. Realizing the importance of this moment that could change their lives, Isabella stood in the spacious hall, contented and with a barely restrained smile on her lips, impatiently awaiting the sight of her unfortunate sister, who was to appear in the company of the old man. Her eyes were shining with keen interest as she eagerly wanted to see Calendia look upset and sad, the epitome of disappointment and pain. However, instead of seeing what she expected, her gaze unexpectedly encountered a young and truly beautiful couple who were elegantly descending the stairs, attracting everyone's attention. Calendia walked hand in hand with her strong and confident husband, who wore an exquisite black fur cape, while she herself shone in her expensive dress, which emphasized her sophistication and grace. Soon, rumors began to spread quickly about how beautiful and sophisticated these people were. Every glance directed at the couple emphasized their elegance and inimitable style. Only Isabella could not contain her indignation, internally burning with anger and misunderstanding, unable to understand why her sister ended up next to such a handsome and young man. Isabella felt unbearable pain, because this young aristocrat with whom her sister was walking was very attractive to her, and she could not allow herself to see them together. The parents who had given their adopted daughter into the hands of the Duke were also in complete shock, not understanding what was happening and how their daughter had ended up in the company of such a noble man, instead of an old man. The head of the family, pushing his wife back, thought angrily, trying to understand why his daughter had chosen such a handsome aristocrat instead of the old man she was supposed to be bound to. The man thought to himself that all this was nothing more than a trick and a lie, unable to believe what was happening, because his mind refused to accept such an incredible development of events. Over time, everyone came to the conclusion that Calendia simply could not come to terms with being with an older man, and so she found herself a younger lover who became her consolation. Isabella, standing among the other aristocrats, refused to believe that her half-sister was married to such a handsome and young man, because in her mind it seemed completely impossible. Suddenly, a voice, with the characteristic sound of a fur cape, was heard calling out to its old friend, and all eyes turned to the approaching figure, sensing the importance of this moment. The old ruler, walking slowly, walked beside his grandson, heading straight towards the Duke. Despite his age, his figure remained majestic, and he continued to inspire those around him with a strength and power that had not lost its power with the years. The ruler began to tap his old friend on the shoulder, expressing his joy that he had finally arrived, and his presence filled the hall with a feeling of warmth and long-awaited meeting. The Duke, standing nearby, thought that the Emperor remained the same man he had always been, a kind, naive fool who continued to endure the embraces of his old friend, even in the most difficult moments of the